He said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Harlan Greer stood in the middle of Main Street, Red Hollow, Montana, blocking Clara Whitmore's path with the full weight of his body and his contempt. He looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately, the way a man examines livestock he has no intention of buying. Then he turned to the three men standing behind him and laughed. Not a quiet laugh, not an embarrassed one, the kind of laugh that was meant to be a weapon. "Lord Almighty," Harlan said, loud enough that two women near the dry goods store stopped walking. "Elias Carter's actually going to let her run cattle decisions? On a working ranch?" He shook his head like the idea caused him physical pain. "What's next? We gonna ask the mule to write the ledger books?" Clara did not look away. That was the thing nobody expected. If you have ever been laughed at in public, truly laughed at, by someone who wanted witnesses, then you already know what it costs to hold your chin level and keep your eyes steady. It costs everything you have that morning, and sometimes it costs more than you think you can spare. This is the story of a woman who paid that price, and then collected what was owed. Before we go any further, if this is your first time finding this channel, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Stories like Clara's don't come along often, and we don't want you missing a single chapter. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Red Hollow. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Red Hollow 3 weeks before that morning on Main Street, and in those 3 weeks she had learned several things about the town that the town did not know about itself. She had learned that the creek running behind the Dunmore feed barn ran shallower on the eastern bank, which meant the soil composition shifted somewhere between the third and fourth fence post, something that would matter enormously when spring planting came around. She had learned that the bay gelding tied outside the sheriff's office every Tuesday favored his left foreleg, which nobody seemed to have noticed despite the animal standing there in plain sight twice a week for what looked like months. She had learned that Harlan Greer owned 40% of the commercial grazing leases in the valley, that he'd acquired them during 2 consecutive drought years when smaller ranchers couldn't make payments, and that he now charged those same ranchers a leasing fee that quietly ensured they would never fully recover. She had also learned, within her first 48 hours in town, that nobody in Red Hollow was particularly interested in what Clara Whitmore had learned about anything. She had come to Montana the way a lot of people came west in 1883, not because she'd chosen it exactly, but because the sequence of events that makes up a life had deposited her here, and here was where she would have to make something work. Her mother had died in February. The house in Ohio had been sold to cover debts her father left behind when he walked out 12 years earlier. Her cousin in Billings had offered a room for 3 months, which had become 2 months, and then the cousin's husband had found work in Cheyenne and the room had stopped being available. A woman alone, 29 years old, with $42 and a trunk of practical clothing, does not have the luxury of being particular about where opportunity presents itself. The posting had been in the Billings Gazette, seeking capable woman for household management and general ranch assistance. Widow preferred, but not required. Room and wages provided. Carter Ranch, Red Hollow. She had written a letter the same afternoon she read it. The letter had been straightforward, which she understood was probably not what most men posting such notices were looking for, but she had long since decided that presenting herself as something other than what she was cost more energy than it returned. She told Elias Carter that she had kept her mother's accounts for 6 years, that she understood basic animal husbandry because her uncle had run a small dairy operation outside of Columbus, that she was not afraid of hard work or harsh weather, and that she was not going to pretend to be fragile to make anyone more comfortable. Elias Carter had written back in 4 days. "Come on, then." That was the entire reply. 2 words, his name scratched beneath them, and directions from the rail station at Clearwater Junction. Clara had thought, reading that letter on her cousin's kitchen table with her trunk already half-packed, that a man who communicated in 2 words was either very confident or very tired. She would later understand that with Elias Carter, it was usually both at once. She had expected the ranch to be struggling. The letter had implied as much, in the way that understatement implies everything it doesn't say. What she had not expected was the specific quality of the struggle, not a ranch falling apart from neglect, but a ranch being dismantled by a sequence of bad luck that had started before Elias could do anything about it, and had not paused long enough since for him to catch his breath. The drought had begun 4 years earlier. Not the worst drought the territory had seen, but the second worst, which meant it lasted long enough for ranchers to exhaust their reserves before the rains came back. Elias had lost a third of his herd in the first year. The second year, a blight moved through the pasture grasses, and he'd had to sell breeding stock to cover feed costs. The third year, his foreman, a man named Declan, who had been with the ranch since Elias's father ran it, broke his leg in a fence repair accident and couldn't work for 5 months, during which time 3 of the younger hands drifted to better-paying operations. By the time Clara arrived, Elias Carter was running a cattle ranch with 4 workers where he'd once had 11, on pasture that was recovering but not recovered, with animals that were healthy enough but not numerous enough, and with a ledger book that showed him losing ground slowly but consistently, the way a man loses blood from a wound nobody can quite locate. He was 36 years old and looked 44. When she stepped off the wagon that his remaining hand, a quiet young man named Pete, had driven to collect her, Elias Carter was standing outside the barn and watching her approach with an expression that was not quite readable. Clara had become skilled, over the years, at reading the moment when someone registered her size, the brief recalibration, the slight adjustment in expectation. And she watched for it automatically now, the way you watch for a step you know is loose. She saw it. It passed across his face in about a second and a half, and then he walked forward and extended his hand. "Miss Whitmore, good trip?" "Long," she said, "but no complications." He nodded. "Dinner's at 6. Pete'll show you the house." That was the end of the introduction. He went back into the barn. She stood there for a moment in the cold October air, her breath visible, looking at the back of a man who had apparently already moved on to whatever came next. Pete, standing beside her with his hat in his hands, glanced at her sideways. "He's not unfriendly," Pete said carefully. "He just doesn't say much that isn't necessary." "I noticed," Clara said. "You'll get used to it." "I'm not bothered by it," she told him, and meant it. She had grown up in a house where words were used primarily as instruments of criticism. A man who didn't waste them struck her as a considerable improvement. The house was small and clean, which she had not taken for granted. There was a room for her off the kitchen, with a window that faced east and a bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar. Someone had put a candle on the small table beside the bed, which was either habitual tidiness or a deliberate gesture of welcome. She decided it didn't matter which. The first week, she did not try to change anything. She watched instead. She watched the way the ranch operated in its daily rhythms. When the men ate, when they worked, what they argued about, what they avoided arguing about, where the inefficiencies were, and more importantly, why those inefficiencies existed. Because inefficiency on a working ranch always comes from somewhere. It's never random. It's the residue of old decisions made under old pressures, and if you don't understand the pressure that created it, you'll dismantle the wrong thing. She watched Elias most carefully, because he was the variable she couldn't predict yet. He was competent. That was clear within the first day. He understood cattle the way some men understand horses, instinctively, physically, as an extension of his own body's knowledge. He could read an animal's condition from 30 feet away and be right about it. He made decisions quickly and didn't second-guess them, which in frontier ranching is often the difference between a herd that survives winter and one that doesn't. But he was also stubborn in the specific way that competent men get stubborn, convinced that the methods that had worked in better years would work again if he simply applied them harder. I was pushing against a situation that had changed, using tools calibrated for conditions that no longer existed, and he hadn't yet admitted that to himself, possibly because admitting it would require him to ask for a kind of help he didn't know how to ask for. Clara recognized this. She had seen it in her mother, who kept managing the household the same way after Clara's father left, as though the right amount of discipline and routine would eventually make the missing income reappear. The stubborn application of a working solution to a problem that had fundamentally changed its shape. On the 8th day, she asked Elias about the east pasture. They were at the dinner table, him, Clara, Pete, and a weathered hand named Roy, who had been with the ranch for 2 years and spoke primarily in short declarative sentences. Elias had mentioned that morning that the herd would be rotating to the east pasture after the weekend. "How long since anyone ran soil checks out there?" Clara asked. Elias looked up from his plate. Not annoyed exactly, more like a man who has registered an unexpected sound and is locating its source. We don't run soil checks, he said. I know, she said. I'm asking when it was last done. It's grazing land. You watch the grass. The grass looks different near the north fence line, Clara said. Shorter, patchier. That's not drainage. The slope runs away from there. That's mineral depletion. And if you rotate the full herd onto depleted ground before you identify how far it extends, you'll spend the winter dealing with calves that didn't develop right. There was a pause. Roy looked at his fork. Pete looked at the ceiling in the specific way of a young man who wants to be elsewhere. Elias Carter looked at Clara for a long moment. You're a housekeeper, he said. Not cruel. Just clarifying the way he understood things. I'm a woman who kept her family alive on 40 acres of failing Ohio farmland for 6 years, Clara said. And I'm telling you the north corner of your east pasture has a problem. She went back to her dinner. You can check it yourself if you'd rather not take my word. He checked it himself. 2 days later, on a cold Thursday morning, she watched from the kitchen window as he walked the fence line alone, crouching periodically, picking up handfuls of soil and examining them with the focused attention of a man who is recalculating something. He came in for lunch and sat down across from her. How far does it go? He asked. I'd estimate about 40 yards in from the fence, maybe 45. You were out there? Tuesday morning, before anyone was up. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. What do you suggest? It was, she would think later, the most important question he ever asked her. Not because of the soil, because of what it cost him to ask it. From a woman, in front of himself, when everything in his upbringing and experience told him that asking was weakness. Rotate to the west pasture first, she said. Give me a week to map the depletion and see if it's isolated or spreading. Then we'll know what we're actually dealing with. He nodded, once, and went back to his lunch. Word got around Red Hollow, as word does in small towns, with a speed that seems to violate the actual distances involved. By the time Clara had been at the Carter Ranch for 3 weeks, people in town were already discussing her, not with curiosity exactly, but with the particular kind of attention that a community pays to something it considers an anomaly. A large woman, alone, working a ranch with a man who wasn't her husband, making suggestions to that man, having those suggestions followed. In a different town, in a different era, the conversation might have stopped there. In Red Hollow in 1883, it became a story that people told to entertain themselves, the way frontier towns entertained themselves, with whatever material was available. The version that reached Harlan Greer had apparently included some embellishment, because by the time he repeated it at the feed store, Clara had apparently been making decisions about cattle operations, overruling experienced ranch hands, and generally conducting herself in a manner that Harlan found, and his word was dangerous. You let a woman start telling you how to run your herd, Harlan said to the group of men gathered near the counter at Henderson's Feed and Supply. You might as well hand her the deed. That's how it starts. One suggestion, then another, and before you know it, she's the one with the authority, and you're the one fetching water. He shook his head slowly, with the satisfied gravity of a man pronouncing a verdict he's already decided. Carter always was too soft. His daddy would have known better. Clara was at the other end of the store when she heard it. She had come in for feed supplements and a replacement latch for the grain room door. She had heard her name. People were never as quiet as they assumed when they were talking about someone, and she had paused in the aisle between the harness equipment and the rope spools, out of Harlan Greer's sightline, and she had listened to the whole speech. She listened not because she was devastated by it. She had been listening to versions of that speech her entire life, and at some point, she couldn't have named exactly when, the devastation had cured into something harder and quieter, a kind of banked anger that didn't burn hot, but never entirely went cold. She listened because she wanted to know, specifically, who she was dealing with, because Harlan Greer's name had already come up in 2 separate conversations she'd had with Pete and Roy, and not in ways that suggested a man who would stay comfortably in the background. What she heard, as she stood very still in the harness aisle, was a man who was afraid. Not of her. That would come later. But afraid of what she represented. Afraid of what happened to the arrangements he'd carefully built if the smaller ranches in the valley started recovering, started making good decisions, started having the kind of year that let them buy back their leased grazing rights. Afraid that Elias Carter's operation, which had been steadily weakening in a way that must have seemed promising to a man who made money from weakness, was about to stop weakening. Clara bought her supplements and her latch and walked out of Henderson's without looking at Harlan Greer. Not because she was avoiding him, because she had everything she needed from him already. She had his voice. She had his fear. She had his name and the shape of what he was willing to do to protect what he'd built. She went home and wrote 3 pages of notes in the small journal she kept in her room, the one no one knew about. Not about feelings, about facts, land ownership records, lease dates. The specific names Harlan had used, the specific phrases, the pattern of what he'd implied without quite saying. Her mother, who had been a practical and unsentimental woman, had told her once, "When someone shows you who they are, don't argue with it. Just remember it." Clara was very good at remembering. The confrontation on Main Street happened on a Tuesday, in broad daylight, in front of 14 witnesses that Clara counted afterward. She had been walking back from the postal office, where she'd sent a letter to a man in Billings who dealt in amended grazing maps, documents that showed historical soil composition and water table levels. The kind of records that rarely occurred to ranchers to consult, but that contained, she suspected, information relevant to the Carter Ranch's long-term situation. Harlan Greer had stepped out from between 2 buildings as though he'd been waiting, and maybe he had been. He had 2 men with him and the air of a performance he'd planned in advance. Clara stopped because there was nowhere to walk without going through him, and she wasn't going to do that. "Miss Whitmore," Harlan said, making her name sound like a punchline he was in no hurry to reach. "Getting comfortable out at Carter's place?" "I work there," Clara said. "That's one word for it." He tilted his head. "You know, most women who come out west looking for a situation, they're honest about what they're looking for. But you're presenting yourself as some kind of ranch advisor, and that's—" He paused, looked at his companions. "That's funny to people who know cattle work." "I've noticed that," Clara said. Her voice was even. She hated that it was even. Part of her wanted to scream at him in the middle of the street in a way that would have satisfied something deep and furious in her chest. But she had learned painfully and over many years that screaming in the middle of the street gives the Harlan Greers of the world exactly what they want: confirmation that you cannot be taken seriously. "Elias Carter's a decent enough man," Harlan continued, louder now, the performance warming up. "But he's making a mistake that's going to cost him. You can't run a working cattle operation on the advice of someone who—" He paused again, looked her over with deliberate slowness. "Who doesn't have the Constitution for it." He said Constitution, not the other words that were obviously sitting just behind his teeth. He was too practiced for that, too careful. He knew which words left marks that could be pointed to later and which ones landed just as hard without the accountability. Clara looked at him, not flinching, not softening, just looking, the way you look at a problem you've already begun solving. "Mr. Greer," she said, "the Carter Ranch's east pasture has a mineral depletion issue that's been there for at least 3 years. It's been affecting calf development in ways that didn't show up, obviously, until you knew what you were looking at." She let that sit for a moment. "I know what I'm looking at." She walked around him and kept going. Behind her, she heard one of his companions say something low and derisive. She heard Harlan laugh, the same public laugh he'd used before, designed to follow her down the street. She let it follow her. She let it land and sit where it was going to sit. And she kept walking, because the alternative, stopping, turning, defending herself to an audience that had already made up its minds, would have given him another minute of her time, and she had work to do. She had a great deal of work to do. The letter from Billings came back 11 days later. The man she'd written to, a cartographer named Albert Reese, who had surveyed much of the central Montana Valley in 1871 and 1872, confirmed that a secondary water channel had historically run through the lower section of the Carter grazing land before an upstream diversion changed its course sometime in the late 1870s. He included a rough map. Clara sat at the kitchen table that evening after dinner, the map smoothed flat in front of her, and traced the line of the old channel with her finger. She traced it from its original source down through what would now be the northwest corner of the Carter property, and she thought about what that channel had deposited in the soil during the years it ran, and what had been missing from that soil since it stopped. Elias came into the kitchen for water and stopped when he saw the map. "What's that?" "A survey from '71, Clara said. "Sit down." He sat down, which still mildly surprised her. That he would do it, without argument, with barely a pause. She had revised her initial read of him twice since arriving. He was stubborn about methods. He was not stubborn about information. If you showed him something real, something with weight and evidence behind it, he would sit down and look at it. That was rarer than it should have been. She explained the channel. She explained what it meant for the soil composition on the northwest grazing sections. She explained that there were ways to partially compensate for the mineral absence through targeted supplementation, and that if the supplementation was calculated correctly, the calves born in the spring, the ones that would represent the herd's recovery, would come through the winter in considerably better condition than the previous 2 years. Elias listened to all of it without interrupting. His coffee went cold while he listened. When she finished, he looked at the map for a long moment. "This is going to work," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "It's not guaranteed," Clara said. "Ranching isn't guaranteed, but it's the right direction, and it's specific, which is better than what you've been doing." He looked up at her. "What have I been doing?" "Hoping," she said, "which is not a strategy." Something moved across his face. Not offense. Something more complicated than that, and more honest. The look of a man who has been told a truth he already knew and was avoiding. "No," he said quietly. "It's not." He rolled up the map carefully and handed it back to her. "What do you need to get started?" Outside, the Montana wind was picking up, moving across the grassland in long, cold sweeps, and the first serious clouds of the coming winter were beginning to stack on the northern horizon. The town of Red Hollow was 2 miles away, and somewhere in it, Harlan Greer was probably sitting in some warm room, confident and comfortable, certain that he understood what was happening on the Carter Ranch. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. And Clara Whitmore, sitting at a kitchen table with a cold lamp, and an 1871 survey map, and a man who had finally asked the right question, was not going to tell him, not until she was ready. The letter from Albert Reese had changed something in the Carter Ranch. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the quiet, specific way that a correct diagnosis changes a sick man's treatment. The supplements Clara calculated were ordered from a supply merchant in Clearwater Junction. The herd rotation was adjusted. The northwest grazing sections were rested for 3 weeks, while the east pasture recovered from the mineral work she'd mapped out. None of it was visible from the road. None of it would show results for months. That was the nature of the work, slow, unglamorous, requiring the kind of patience that looks like nothing is happening right up until everything happens at once. Elias understood this, intellectually. But understanding something and living inside it are different experiences. And there were mornings when Clara came into the kitchen and found him standing at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand, staring out at the pasture with an expression that she had started to recognize. The look of a man counting days he wasn't sure he had. "Stop doing that," she said one morning, setting the skillet on the stove without preamble. He turned. "Doing what?" "Calculating how long you can hold on. It changes every day, and it's not a useful number." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't know what I was thinking." "You were standing at the window for 11 minutes, Clara said. "I know exactly what you were thinking." He didn't argue with that. He sat down at the table and picked up his fork and was quiet for a while. And then he said, without looking at her, "Roy told me Harlan Greer's been talking to the Dunmore brothers about the South Lease." Clara kept her attention on the eggs. "When?" "Sometime last week. Roy heard it from the feed store boy." Elias set his fork down. "The South Lease is the one I've been carrying at a loss for 2 years. If Greer gets the Dunmores to call the note early—" "He can't call a note he doesn't hold," Clara said. "He doesn't have to hold it. He just has to convince the people who do that they'd be better off settling now than waiting." She put the eggs on his plate and sat down across from him. "How much time do you have on the South Lease?" 14 months, on paper." "On paper," she repeated. "The Dunmore brothers are not—" He stopped, chose his words. "They're not hard men. They'll listen to whoever talks to them last and loudest." Clara ate for a moment without speaking. "Then we make sure we talk to them before Greer does." "I've got no leverage to offer them. The ranch isn't producing enough yet to—" "You don't need leverage," Clara said. "You need to be specific. Specific is more convincing than leverage when you're dealing with men who are nervous." She looked at him directly. "Do you trust me on this?" The question sat between them, heavier than it sounded. Elias Carter was not a man who trusted easily. That was evident in everything from the way he listened to the way he stood, always slightly turned toward the exit of any room he was in, always with one part of his attention reserved and uncommitted. It wasn't hostility. It was the caution of a man who had been disappointed by things he'd relied on. "I'm still here, aren't I?" he said finally. It wasn't exactly yes, but from Elias Carter, it was close enough. She rode to the Dunmore property on a Thursday, alone, on the gray mare that Pete had saddled for her without comment, and with the particular tact of a young man who knew better than to volunteer opinions. It was a 12-mile ride along the valley road, and the morning was cold and flat-skied in the way that late autumn gets in Montana. Not dramatic, just relentless, the cold sitting in the air without announcing itself. Frank and Edgar Dunmore were brothers in their late 50s who had come to Montana from Wisconsin in 1869 and built a modest operation in the southeast quarter of the valley. They were not unkind men. They were also not perceptive men, which was perhaps the more relevant quality in the current situation. They had lent money to Elias Carter at a fair rate 2 years ago because they liked his father, who had been dead for 7 years, and because the loan had seemed safe at the time. Now it felt less safe, and the Dunmores were responding to that feeling the way nervous men generally respond, by listening to anyone who offered them a clear and confident version of what was happening. Harlan Greer had visited them 6 days ago. Clara had confirmed this through a source she did not name to Elias and would not. Marta Henderson, who ran the dry goods side of Henderson's feed and supply, and who had been quietly keeping track of Harlan Greer's movements and conversations for 2 years, for reasons of her own that Clara had gathered were connected to a parcel of land that had changed hands during the drought, in circumstances Marta still considered questionable. Women in small frontier towns knew things that men in those same towns never quite managed to know, because women were present in spaces where information passed without anyone thinking to be careful about it. Clara had recognized this within her second week in Red Hollow, and she had been building those connections with the deliberate patience she applied to everything that mattered. When she arrived at the Dunmore place, Edgar was in the yard, and he looked at her with the mild alarm of a man confronting something he hasn't categorized yet. "Miss Whitmore," he said, because her name had apparently made it out here too. "From Carter's ranch." "That's right," she said, dismounting. "Is your brother here?" Frank came out from the barn a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a rag, and the two of them stood in the yard looking at her with the wary attentiveness of men who have recently been convinced to make a decision and are now watching the door to see if it might be a mistake. "I won't take much of your time," Clara said. She opened the saddlebag and removed the folder she'd prepared. 3 pages, neat columns, specific numbers. Not a plea, a report. "I want to show you what's actually happening at the Carter Ranch right now, as opposed to what you may have been told is happening." Edgar exchanged a look with his brother. "We've had some concerns." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm here. Look at the numbers first, then we can talk about concerns." She had learned this from her mother too. Don't argue with someone's fear. The fear is real, even when it's been put there by someone with an interest in putting it there. Argue with it directly and you make it worse. Show the person something concrete instead, something they can see and touch and count, and give the fear something else to attach to. The numbers Clara had prepared were genuine. The supplementation program's projected impact on spring calf yield, the grazing rotation schedule and its effect on pasture recovery, the mineral work, and what it would mean for herd health over the next 18 months. She had been conservative in her projections, deliberately so, because men like the Dunmores trusted conservative numbers more than optimistic ones. They stood in the cold yard and read through the pages. Frank asked 2 questions, both of them sharp and practical, and Clara answered them without hedging. Edgar looked up after a while. "Greer said the ranch was circling the drain." "Greer has financial interests in the Carter Ranch's grazing leases," Clara said. "Not as a lender, as a competitor. If the ranch fails, those leases become available. I thought you might want to know that when you're evaluating his opinion." Silence. The two brothers looked at each other with the particular communication of men who have known each other for decades. A whole conversation conducted in the slight shift of an eyebrow and the angle of a jaw. "He didn't mention that," Frank said slowly. "No," Clara said. "I didn't think he would." She did not push further. She folded the papers back into the folder and handed it to Frank, who took it with the somewhat dazed expression of a man who has had a piece of furniture he was leaning on suddenly turn out to be more solid than expected. We'll need some time to look this over, Frank said. Of course, Clara said. Take whatever time you need. She remounted the gray mare. I just wanted to make sure you had the full picture before you made any decisions. Whatever you decide, that's your right. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. Good day to you both. She rode home along the valley road without looking back. She didn't need to. She knew what the Dunmores would do, in the same way she had begun to know things about this valley and the people in it. Not through intuition exactly, but through the accumulated observation of someone who had been paying close attention for long enough that patterns had become visible. They would not call the note early, not immediately, anyway. She had bought time. How much time, she couldn't be certain, but some. When she got back to the ranch, Pete was fixing the water trough, and Roy was somewhere out with the cattle, and Elias was standing at the fence line of the north pasture, watching the herd with his hands in his pockets. She put up the horse and walked out to where he stood. Well, he said, without looking at her. We have time, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The cattle moved slowly across the recovering grass. How much? Enough, Clara said, if we use it right. The second month of winter arrived with a cold front that dropped temperatures across the valley by 15 degrees in 2 days and set every rancher in the territory to anxious recalculation of their feed reserves. For the Carter Ranch, this meant 3 things. The supplementation schedule had to be adjusted. The water sources in the lower pasture needed to be checked daily for ice over, and the older animals in the herd. A dozen head that Elias had been planning to sell in spring became vulnerable in ways they hadn't been a week before. Clara had been preparing for winter with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. She had spent October mapping the wind patterns on the ranch, because wind mattered more than most ranchers accounted for. Not just the cold it brought, but the directions it came from, and what that meant for which parts of the pasture became lethal, and which parts retained enough ambient warmth to be defensible. She had identified 3 natural windbreaks on the property that weren't being used, and she and Pete had spent 3 days in November cutting and stacking additional brush to extend 2 of them. Elias had watched this process with the focused silence of a man absorbing something he recognizes but couldn't have named. He didn't ask questions while she worked. He helped. That was how it had been developing between them. Not conversation so much as parallel action, 2 people moving in the same direction without always explaining why. The older animals were moved to the sheltered southeast pasture, which Clara had identified in October as the most protected area on the property. The feed calculations were adjusted daily. She checked the water sources herself every morning before sunrise, because Roy's eyes weren't reliable in the dark, and Pete tended to underestimate ice formation rates. You don't have to do that, Elias told her one morning, when he found her coming back from the lower pasture in the dark, her coat stiff with cold, and her breath coming in short, visible bursts. Someone does, Clara said. That's Roy's job. Roy got the thickness wrong twice this week, she said. If the ice seals over a water source and the cattle don't realize it, they'll start dehydrating before anyone notices. Dehydrated cattle in a cold snap. I know what happens, Elias said. He was looking at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, somewhere between exasperation and something more complicated. You're going to kill yourself trying to cover everything. I'm cold, she said. I'm not dying. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He went to the kitchen and came back with coffee, handing it to her at the door without ceremony. She held the cup in both hands and let the warmth move through her fingers. And they stood there for a moment in the dark of the early morning, the cold sitting heavy on the ranch, the cattle invisible in the pasture, but audible, low shifting sounds that meant the herd was restless but not panicked. The Greer situation, Elias said quietly. He's going to push again. I know. I heard he's been talking to Aldous Fry at the bank. Clara had heard this too, from Marta Henderson, 3 days ago. Aldous Fry was the manager of the Clearwater Junction Savings and Loan, which held the primary mortgage on the Carter Ranch property. He was a careful man, not corrupt exactly, just susceptible to the confident presentation of risk. Harlan Greer was very good at presenting risk confidently. What did you hear? That Greer's suggesting the property's assessed value has dropped enough that my collateral's underwater, that the bank should consider its position. Elias's voice was flat. The specific flatness of a man keeping something held down by force. which is not something Greer would have any way of knowing unless someone at the bank was talking to him. Aldous Fry is not a dishonest man, Clara said carefully. He's a frightened one, and Greer is very good at frightening people. What do we do about the bank? Clara turned the coffee cup in her hands. She had been thinking about this since Marta had told her about the Fry conversation. We give him something he can take to the board, something concrete, something documented, that shows the ranch's trajectory is upward. She paused. I need 2 weeks to put it together properly. Can you keep Greer away from Fry for 2 weeks? How am I supposed to do that? I don't know, she said honestly, but I suspect you can think of something. She went inside with the coffee. You're not actually bad at this, Elias. You just convinced yourself you were. She heard him exhale behind her, a long, slow breath that carried something in it she couldn't name. Not defeat, not hope. Somewhere in the complicated territory between those two places where most real decisions get made. She had been at the ranch for 7 weeks when the sabotage started. She recognized it for what it was immediately, which was perhaps the advantage of having spent her life among people who were less honest about their hostility than they believed themselves to be. The first incident was the East Pasture water line, which was found disconnected at the joint on a Tuesday morning in a way that didn't match any natural failure pattern. The joint was tight everywhere except at one specific coupling, which had been loosened, not broken. Roy found it. He reported it to Elias as a mechanical failure. Clara looked at it herself and kept her conclusions to herself for the time being. The second incident was the feed supplement order, which arrived from Clearwater Junction 2 days late, with a note from the merchant explaining that the order had been held up due to a billing discrepancy. A discrepancy that, when Clara examined the original order documentation, did not exist. Someone had contacted the merchant and introduced a question about the order's validity. The merchant, a cautious man, had held the delivery pending clarification. The delay wasn't long enough to cause serious harm, but it was long enough to remind Clara that someone was watching the ranch closely enough to know the details of their supply schedule. The third incident, she found herself on a Friday evening when she went to check the southeast pasture where the older animals were sheltered. 3 fence posts on the northern edge had been pulled from the ground and laid flat. Not fallen, pulled deliberately, with enough force to crack 2 of them at the base. The older cattle had drifted through the gap into an area with no shelter from the north wind, and 2 of the oldest cows were standing stiffly, their backs to the wind, in a posture that meant they'd been exposed long enough to be a concern. Clara got the animals moved back before anyone else saw the fence, and then she walked the perimeter of the southeast pasture alone in the last light of the Friday evening, reading the ground the way she'd taught herself to read it, for disturbance, for the traces of deliberate human action rather than natural event. She found boot prints near the northernmost damaged post. 2 sets, both headed back toward the road. She did not tell Elias that night. She told Pete because Pete was the one she trusted most not to react in a way that created more problems than it solved. He listened to her, standing in the barn with his hat in his hands, and his face went through several changes that he was too young to hide completely. You think it's Greer's people? Pete said. I think it's people who know this ranch's layout well enough to get to the southeast pasture fence line without being seen from the house, Clara said, which narrows it down. If Elias finds out, he's going to find out, Clara said. I'm telling him tomorrow. I just want to have more information before I do. She looked at Pete steadily. I need you to remember very carefully which hands have been in and out of this property in the last 2 weeks that don't normally work here. Deliveries, fence crews, anyone. Pete thought about it with the careful focus of a young man who took being asked seriously as a serious thing. There was a man who came about the hay delivery, didn't recognize him from before. Usually it's Old Marsh from the Clearwater Depot. What did he look like? Pete described him in the imprecise way of someone who hadn't been paying specific attention, which gave Clara a partial picture but not a full one. It was enough to work with. Don't mention this to Roy, Clara said. Pete looked at her. You don't think Roy... I don't know what Roy knows or doesn't know, Clara said carefully. And until I do, I'd rather keep the circle small. She told Elias in the morning, over coffee, while Roy was still out with the herd and Pete was mending harness in the barn. She told him all 3 incidents, in order, with the details she had. She watched his face as she talked. The flatness came back. That contained quality that she now understood was not coldness, but the specific discipline of a man keeping himself from doing something immediate and probably counterproductive. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You should have told me about the waterline," he said. "I didn't have enough information yet to tell you anything useful," Clara said. "I wasn't going to hand you a problem without at least the outline of a solution. It's my ranch, and those are my responsibilities," she said. "You hired me to manage things. I'm managing." He looked at her across the table with something in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not quite anger, not quite gratitude, but something compressed between them that had more dimensions than either of those. "Greer's escalating," he said. "Yes." "Which means he's worried." "Which means," Clara said, "that whatever we're doing is working well enough to threaten him." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "We just need to keep working." "And if he does something more serious than fence posts?" Clara met his eyes. "Then we'll deal with something more serious than fence posts." She paused. "But I don't think that's his style, Elias. Greer's not a violent man. He's an institutional man. He works through banks and leases and reputations. The physical damage is meant to rattle you, not hurt you. He wants you to make a bad decision from a rattled state. Like selling, or taking a bad loan, or rotating your herd wrong, something that sets you back 6 months and gives him the window he needs." She looked at him directly. "Don't give him the window." Elias stood up and took his cup to the window and stood there the way he did when he was working something through. Outside, the Montana winter had settled fully over the valley. The light was thin and white, the grass in the ungrazed pastures standing stiff with frost. The sky, the particular pale gray that meant no storm today, but possibly tomorrow. "I'm going to talk to Roy," Elias said. "I'd wait," Clara said. "A few more days, let me—" "He's worked this ranch for 2 years," Elias said. "If he's involved in this, I need to know. And if he's not, he deserves to know what's happening on his own property." Clara considered this. It was a different kind of judgment than her own, more relational, less strategic. She wasn't sure it was wrong. "All right," she said, "but let me be there when you talk to him." Roy's reaction to what Elias told him was uncomplicated and immediate, and Clara watched it with the careful attention she gave to all genuine emotional responses. Because genuine responses told you things that were worth knowing. He was angry, not guilty angry, not the particular quality of anger that reads as performance over concealment. Straightforwardly, simply furious, in the way of a man who has been working beside something without knowing it was there. He turned the information over, asked 2 questions, and then sat in silence for a moment with his jaw set hard. "The hay delivery man," he said finally, without being prompted. "I noticed he spent longer than normal near the south water line. Thought he was looking at something that caught his eye. Didn't think enough of it." He looked at his boots. "I should have said something." "You didn't know there was anything to say," Clara said. "I should have noticed." That was all Roy said about that. He straightened up and looked at Elias. "What do you need me to do?" The 3 of them, 4, including Pete, spent the next hour going over the ranch's vulnerable points and assigning responsibility for each. It was not a comfortable conversation. There were moments of friction, particularly between Roy and Clara, where their different instincts about how to address the threat came up against each other with the specific abrasiveness of 2 people who are not wrong exactly, but are not quite thinking about the same problem. Roy wanted to set watches, make the sabotage harder. Clara wanted to document and preserve, make evidence of it usable. Elias wanted both and said so. "You can't eat documentation," Roy muttered. "You can't take watches to court," Clara said. "Who said anything about court?" "I did," Clara said flatly, "because that's where this ends, if it goes where I think it might go." Roy looked at her. He was not hostile exactly, but he was a man who had learned his world through physical work and physical consequence, and the idea of resolving something in a courtroom struck him as abstract in a way that made him uncomfortable. "And you think you know where it goes?" "I think I know enough of Harlan Greer's history in this valley to have a reasonable theory," Clara said, "and I think the Dunmores aren't the only people he squeezed during a drought year." She looked at Roy steadily. "Do you know anyone else who lost land to him?" Roy was quiet for a moment. Something crossed his face, recognition, and something older under it. "Jim Ballard," he said, "lost his East 40 in '81. Always said the note terms weren't what he'd agreed to, but by the time he had the money to challenge it, The land had changed hands twice. Is Ballard still in the valley? Over near Sutter Creek. Got a small place. Would he talk to me? Roy looked at her for another long moment, and whatever calculation was happening behind his eyes, it came out somewhere different from where it had started. Probably, he said. If I came with you. Clara nodded. Good. Next week then, before the weather turns. The weather turned before the week was out. Not the catastrophic storm that would come later, that was still weeks away, building itself somewhere north of the territory with a patience that weather has and people don't. This was a preliminary storm, a warning in the language that Montana winters speak. 2 days of hard wind and driving snow that closed the valley road and kept everyone on their properties and gave Clara 48 uninterrupted hours inside the ranch house with nothing to do but think. She was not good at uninterrupted thinking in the sense of finding it comfortable. Her mind was the kind that worked better when it was connected to action, when the thinking had somewhere to go. 2 days trapped inside with the wind shaking the windows and the cattle audible in the barn, and Elias Carter at the other end of the table working through ledger books with the focused unhappiness of a man doing arithmetic on a situation he wishes were different. That was harder. On the second night, when Pete and Roy had gone to their quarters and the lamp on the table was low and the storm outside was a constant, undifferentiated roar, Elias looked up from his ledger and said, "Why did you really come here?" Clara looked at him. She had been recopying her notes from the Dunmore visit into a cleaner version, and she set the pen down. "The posting," she said. "I told you." "You had $42 and a trunk," he said. He had evidently been holding this question for some time. A woman who could put together what you've put together in 7 weeks. Why Montana? Why a failing cattle ranch? "Because it's what was available," she said. "There are other things that would have been available to someone like you." "Someone like me," Clara repeated. He met her eyes. He did not look away. "I mean someone who thinks the way you think. There are schools don't offer housing," she said. "And positions that offer housing to women at $30 a month don't generally go to women who look like me." The silence that followed was the honest kind. Not comfortable, but not dishonest either. Elias did not try to argue with it or soften it, which she found she respected. "Their loss," he said, and went back to his ledger. Clara looked at him for a moment, at the top of his head bent over the books, at the way his shoulders carried the particular tension of a man who has been holding weight for years. Then she picked up her pen and went back to her notes. Outside, the storm pushed against the windows with a force that was impressive even at a distance, and the lamp between them on the table threw a circle of yellow light that barely reached the walls, and the ranch was quiet except for the wind and the distant cattle and the small sounds of 2 people working in the same room who were not, quite, strangers anymore. Harlan Greer was somewhere on the other side of the storm in his warm house, and he had plans he thought were solid. He had leveraged banks and rattled fences and positioned himself with the patience of a man who believed he understood the situation completely. He did not understand the situation, not yet. He had been watching the Carter Ranch and seeing a failing operation with a stubborn owner and an inconvenient woman who would eventually run out of ideas. He had not been watching Clara Whitmore carefully enough to know that she did not run out of ideas. She ran toward problems. She went looking for the specific shape of what was wrong, and she stayed with it until she found something she could work with. She had more information now than she'd had 3 weeks ago. She had the Dunmores, cautious and watchful, but not broken. She had Roy's testimony about Jim Ballard and the East 40. She had 3 incidents of documented sabotage, 2 of them with physical evidence she had preserved. She had Albert Reese's survey map and the supplementation program and the grazing rotation and 14 months on the South lease, and a bank manager in Clearwater Junction who was nervous but not yet committed to anything irreversible. She had, in other words, the beginning of something, not a plan exactly, more like the raw material of one, the kind that looks like scattered pieces until the moment it doesn't, until the moment the pattern becomes clear enough that the next move becomes obvious. She wrote until the lamp ran low, and then she put out the light and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the storm. There was work to do. There was a great deal of work to do, and the winter, she knew now, was only getting started. The preliminary storm passed in 2 days and left the valley rearranged in the specific way that serious winter weather rearranges things. Not destroyed, but shifted, every familiar landmark wearing a new coat of white that made distances uncertain and footing unreliable. The road to Sutter Creek opened on the third day, and Clara and Roy rode out to see Jim Ballard before anything else could prevent it. Roy had sent word ahead with a rider he trusted, a teenage boy from a neighboring property who made a modest income carrying messages across the valley. Jim Ballard had sent back a single line, "Come Thursday morning. I'll be here." Ballard was a lean man in his early 60s, with the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent decades outside and had not been sheltered from any of it. He met them at his fence line, which Clara noted with the part of her attention she kept permanently calibrated for such things, was in excellent repair. Tight wire, solid posts, the work of a man who cared for what he had left, even after losing what he'd lost. He shook Roy's hand and looked at Clara with the measuring look she'd come to recognize, the one that was taking inventory, deciding how much to say. "Roy tells me you've been looking into Greer's land dealings," Ballard said, not wasting time on preamble. "I've been gathering information," Clara said. "I don't have conclusions yet. I have questions." "Ask them." They sat in his kitchen, which was clean in the way of a man living alone who has not yet given up on himself, and Ballard talked for an hour and 20 minutes. He talked about the East 40, how he'd borrowed against it in 1879 during the first drought year, how the note terms had specified a 3-year repayment window with a fixed rate, and how by the time the second drought year hit and he'd missed 2 payments, the documentation Greer's man brought to the table for renegotiation showed different terms than the ones Ballard remembered agreeing to. Not drastically different, subtly different, the kind of difference a man might doubt his own memory about, particularly a man who was frightened and exhausted and had been up for 36 hours dealing with sick cattle. "Did you have a copy of the original terms?" Clara asked. "I had what I thought was a copy," Ballard said. "When I went to look at it after, it wasn't the same document, same paper, same ink, near enough the same handwriting, but 2 of the clauses were different." He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not an educated man, Miss Whitmore. I know cattle, and I know land. I don't know documents. By the time I understood what had happened, the East 40 had changed hands, and Greer had a bill of sale with my signature on it." "Your signature on the renegotiated document," Clara said, "which I signed because I was tired and scared, and he told me it was the same as what we'd agreed before." Ballard's jaw tightened. "I have thought about that moment every day for 4 years." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Are you still in possession of what you believe to be your copy of the original terms?" Ballard looked at her steadily. "I am." "Would you allow me to have it examined by someone who knows document authentication?" The silence that followed was the kind that meant the person was deciding something that would cost them something. Ballard had been carrying this for 4 years. Not just the loss of the land, but the particular humiliation of having been fooled, of having signed something he shouldn't have signed, of not having been smart enough or fast enough to protect himself. Bringing it out again, handing it to someone else, was not a small thing. "What would you do with it?" he said. "I don't know yet," Clara said honestly. "But if Greer did this to you, he's done it to others. And if it's been done to enough others, it stops being one man's word against another's." Ballard looked at Roy. Roy met his eyes and gave a slight nod. Not urging, just present. The nod of a man saying, "I trust her, for what it's worth." "All right," Ballard said. He pushed back from the table and went to a wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace and came back with a folded piece of paper that had been handled many times and was soft at the creases from it. He set it on the table in front of Clara. She unfolded it carefully. She read it carefully. And the thing she felt, reading it, was not triumph or excitement. Those were the wrong emotions for this moment. What she felt was the cold, particular clarity of someone who has located the exact mechanism of an injury and now understands precisely how it was inflicted. She folded it back along its original creases and placed it in the inner pocket of her coat. "I'll protect this," she said, "and I'll tell you everything I do with it before I do it." Ballard nodded once. He did not look relieved exactly. He looked like a man who has set down a weight he'd forgotten he was carrying. They rode back to the Carter Ranch in the thin winter afternoon light, and Roy did not talk for the first several miles, which Clara understood was not hostility, but processing. Roy was a man who absorbed things slowly and thoroughly, the way cold water absorbed into good soil. It went deep and stayed. "You think there are others," he said eventually. "I think Greer's been operating in this valley for 12 years, and the drought gave him 2 windows of about 18 months each," Clara said. "That's a lot of opportunity for a patient man. And you think you can prove it?" "I think I can build something that makes denial difficult," Clara said, "which is different from proof. But it's often enough." Roy considered this. "What do you need?" "Names. People who dealt with Greer during the drought years and came out with less than they went in. I don't need everyone. I need enough to show a pattern." "I can think of 3, maybe 4 people, just from my own knowing," Roy said. "There might be more I don't know about." "Can you reach them quietly, without Greer's people noticing?" Roy glanced at her sidelong. He had, over the past weeks, developed a look specifically calibrated for moments when Clara asked him to do something he found simultaneously logical and unsettling. "You think he's got people watching?" "I think he's been watching the Carter Ranch closely enough to know our supply schedule," Clara said. "So, yes." "Then I'll be careful," Roy said. He was quiet again for a moment. "Miss Whitmore, what happens to Elias if this doesn't work?" It was the most direct question Roy had ever asked her, and she respected it enough to answer it directly. "He loses the ranch within 6 to 8 months. The bank will call the mortgage once Greer gives them enough reason to be nervous, and the south lease will go one way or another. Without the lease, the remaining herd isn't viable." "And with you?" Clara looked at the road ahead. "With the right evidence and the right pressure, Greer's leverage over the banks and the leaseholders weakens considerably. A man who's being investigated for document fraud doesn't make a credible advisor on anyone's financial situation." She paused. "But it has to be documented, it has to be specific, and it has to be presented by someone the territory will listen to." "Which is not you," Roy said. Not unkindly, just accurately. "Which is not me, Clara agreed. "Not alone. Which is why I need you, and the Dunmores, and Ballard, and whoever else you can bring in. And why I need Elias to stay steady and not do anything that gives Greer an opening." "That last part's going to be the hardest," Roy said quietly, and Clara thought he was probably right. She told Elias about Ballard that evening, all of it, including the document. He listened with the focused stillness that she had come to understand meant he was taking something seriously, not the restless attention of a man half thinking about something else, but the particular quality of someone who has stopped everything else in order to hear. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's been doing this since before the drought." "Probably," Clara said. "The drought just gave him more victims." "And you think the document is enough?" "I think the document is the beginning," she said. "It needs to be authenticated. I need to find someone with the proper qualifications. A land attorney, ideally, or a county surveyor who's worked with legal documents. Someone whose professional opinion would carry weight." "In Clearwater Junction?" "Not Clearwater Junction," Clara said. "Greer has too many connections there. Billings, maybe. Or Helena." Elias was quiet again. She could see him calculating, not just the legal angle, but the practical one. The cost of bringing someone from Helena, the time it would take, the exposure of the effort itself, which would become visible to Greer's network the moment it started. "I have someone in Helena I can write to," he said finally. Clara looked at him with mild surprise, which she didn't bother to conceal. "My father was not without connections," Elias said. There was something in his voice when he mentioned his father, not grief exactly, more like the complicated residue of a relationship that had been important and imperfect and was now permanently unfinished. "There's a man named Horace Whitfield, land attorney. Did some title work for my father in '74 when the North Pasture boundary was disputed. He's honest. Would he come?" "I don't know," Elias said. "But I can ask." He paused. "I should have asked him for help a year ago." "You didn't know what you were dealing with a year ago," Clara said. "I knew Greer was circling." Knowing someone is circling and knowing what they're actually doing are different things. She looked at him across the table. "Write to Whitfield. Tonight, if you can. And Elias," she waited until he met her eyes, "don't tell anyone you're writing to him. Not Pete, not Roy, not yet." He looked at her for a moment with the specific quality she'd noticed, that reserved, assessing look that preceded his trust by about 3 seconds. "All right," he said. He wrote the letter that night. She heard him at the table after she'd gone to her room, the scratch of his pen in the quiet of the house, and she lay in the dark and listened to it and thought about Harlan Greer and his warm house, confident and patient, and about how patience was not the same as being right. The month of December arrived and tightened its grip on the valley, and life on the Carter Ranch settled into the hard, specific rhythms of a Montana winter. The daily maintenance of survival, the constant small vigilance against the ways that cold and wind and ice conspired to undo what warmth had built. Clara moved through it with the methodical attention she brought to everything, checking water sources in the dark mornings, tracking the older animals in the southeast pasture, adjusting feed calculations as temperatures shifted. The supplementation program was working. This was becoming visible in the herd in ways that Clara tracked carefully and documented in the ledger she'd begun keeping for the spring calving projections. The animals were holding weight better than the previous 2 winters. The coat quality on the younger cattle was measurably improved. Small things, unglamorous things, the kind of progress that no one photographs or celebrates, that only becomes obvious in the cumulative accounting of spring. But there were days when the gap between what was working slowly and what might go wrong quickly felt very large. Roy came back from Sutter Creek in the second week of December with 2 names: a woman named Grace Nolan, who had lost a grazing lease in 1880 under circumstances she'd always considered suspicious, and a man named Curtis Webb, whose water rights claim had been renegotiated during the second drought year in ways that still didn't entirely make sense to him. Roy had spoken to both of them carefully, without revealing the full scope of what Clara was building, and both had expressed willingness to talk. Clara rode out to see Grace Nolan first, because something in Roy's description of the woman, her directness, the particular quality of her anger, which Roy characterized as not worn out, just contained, suggested she would be the more useful of the 2. Grace Nolan was 61 years old and ran a small horse breeding operation outside of Sutter Creek with her adult son and a hired man. She had the look of a woman who had been told a great many things she hadn't believed and had been right not to believe them. She offered Clara coffee and sat across from her at a table that was covered in breeding records and feed invoices, and she told her story with the precise economy of someone who has told it before in her own head, many times, and knows exactly which parts matter. The grazing lease she'd lost had been her husband's, who died of a fever in January of 1879, leaving Grace with the operation, a son of 12, and a lease on valley grazing land that was the difference between a viable operation and one that wasn't. Greer had appeared 2 months after the funeral. Not immediately, Grace said, with the first trace of dark humor Clara had heard in the conversation. Not so soon that it would look opportunistic. He had offered to assist with the renegotiation of the lease terms given the changed circumstances, positioning himself as a helpful neighbor. The renegotiation had resulted in terms that were worse than the originals in 3 specific ways, none of which Grace had understood clearly until the following year, when the implications became concrete. "I had a lawyer look at it eventually," Grace said. "Not someone from around here. My cousin's husband, from Great Falls. He said the document I'd signed was legal, but that the presentation of it to me had been—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Misleading." "Misleading how?" Clara asked. "He told me I was signing an extension of the original terms. What I was actually signing was a new agreement with different terms presented as an extension." Grace's voice was flat. "My husband taught me to read a contract. I'd always read everything I signed before he died. But I was 2 months out from burying him, and my son was 12 years old, and I was barely sleeping, and Greer sat at this table right here and told me it was a formality, and I—" She stopped. "I signed it." The room was quiet for a moment. "I'm not telling you this for sympathy," Grace said sharply, as though Clara might have been about to offer some. "I'm telling you because you asked, and because if something is being done about it, I want to know. Something may be possible. I need to know. Do you still have the original lease documents? Both the one you signed when your husband first took the lease and the renegotiated one?" "I have everything," Grace said. "I have kept everything." She went to a cabinet and came back with a folder that was thick with paper, organized with a precision that Clara found immediately, viscerally reassuring. Not the chaos of someone who'd shoved documents away because they couldn't bear to look at them. The careful organization of someone who had kept them ready because she believed that one day they might matter. Clara spent an hour and a half going through the folder with Grace, and what she found confirmed and extended what she'd seen in Ballard's document. The pattern was not identical. Greer was too careful for that, but the underlying method was consistent. The appearance of assistance, the timing, always during vulnerability, the subtle alteration of terms presented as routine paperwork, the signature obtained under conditions of stress or trust or simple exhaustion. When Clara left the Nolan property, she had not taken any documents. She'd made careful notes instead and told Grace exactly what she intended to do with the information. But she carried something with her that was more valuable than documents at this particular moment. She carried the clear, specific shape of Harlan Greer's method, which she could now see completely enough to describe it in terms that a land attorney would recognize. She rode back toward Red Hollow in the late afternoon, with the winter light already failing and the temperature dropping toward the particular cold that preceded clear nights in Montana, and she thought about Horace Whitfield and Helena and whether Elias's letter had reached him yet. The letter had reached him. The reply came back 11 days after Elias sent it, forwarded through a postal connection in Billings that Whitfield apparently maintained for correspondence he considered sensitive. The reply was 3 pages, which was more than either of them had expected from a man they'd characterized as economical with words. Whitfield had not only remembered Elias's father, he had, apparently, been following developments in the Red Hollow Valley with the interest of a man who has professional reasons to care about land transaction patterns in the territory. He wrote that he had seen, in his practice over the past 5 years, an increase in disputes involving what he carefully termed documents whose terms were represented to signatories differently from their actual content. He wrote that he was aware of several cases originating from the same General Valley region, though he had not yet been able to connect them to a single source. He wrote that if Elias had specific evidence of a systematic pattern, he would be interested in examining it at the earliest practical opportunity. He wrote that he could be in Red Hollow within 2 weeks. Elias read the letter at the kitchen table in the evening and then passed it to Clara without speaking. She read it twice. The second time she was aware of something shifting in her chest. Not hope exactly, because hope was still too fragile and too warm for what this was. Something more structural than hope. The feeling of a foundation being poured under something that had been standing on uncertain ground. "He's seen it before," she said. "Multiple times," Elias said. "Then we're not building this from nothing." She set the letter down. "We're connecting dots he already knows exist." Elias looked at her across the table. "You thought this was going to be harder." "I thought it might not be possible at all," Clara said honestly. "I've been building it piece by piece without knowing if the pieces were going to add up to anything a court would care about." She paused. "This changes that." "Don't get ahead of yourself," Elias said. "I'm not." She looked at him. "I'm telling you what changed. I'm not telling you we've won anything." He almost smiled. It was the expression that appeared on his face when she said something that matched his own thinking so closely it caught him off guard. A slight shift at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully arrived. "Write back to him," Elias said. "Tell him to come." Harlan Greer found out about Whitfield on a Wednesday morning, 8 days before the attorney was due to arrive. Clara didn't know how he found out. The letter had been sent through the Billings connection, which she'd believed was discreet. But small valleys had long ears, and Greer had spent 12 years cultivating sources in every direction. She learned of it through Marta Henderson, who arrived at the ranch on a gray Wednesday morning in an unexpected manner, driving herself in a small wagon, alone, which was unusual enough that Pete called for Clara before he'd even finished taking the horse. Marta came inside and sat at the kitchen table with the compressed, purposeful energy of a woman who has made a decision and is moving on it before she changes her mind. She had brought no preamble and needed none. "Greer knows someone's coming from Helena," she said. "He doesn't know who yet, but he knows it's legal, and he's preparing." Clara felt the cold settle in her stomach. "Preparing how?" "He went to Aldous Fry at the bank yesterday. I don't know what he said, but Fry came out of the meeting looking like a man who's been given a deadline." Marta folded her hands on the table. "And this morning, one of Greer's men went out to the Dunmore property." The Dunmores. Claire had been checking in with Frank Dunmore by way of a weekly note sent through Pete, who had a cousin near their road. The notes had been steady, cautious but steady, which she'd taken as a sign that her visit in November had held. "Do you know why?" "No," Marta said. "I only know he went." She looked at Clara directly. "Whatever you're building, you need to move faster." Clara was quiet for a moment. "What's your stake in this, Marta?" It was a direct question, and she'd been waiting to ask it since the first time Marta had brought her information in the feed store. The woman across the table from her was not someone who acted without reason, and Clara had a theory about the reason, but she'd wanted to hear it from Marta herself. Marta looked at her steadily. "My husband sold his grazing parcel in 1880 during the drought. He said it was a fair sale. He said it was his decision." A pause. "After he died, I found the original correspondence with Greer. My husband had asked to borrow against the parcel, not to sell it. What he signed was a sale." Her voice was perfectly controlled. "He never knew. He thought he'd made a reasonable business decision under pressure. He died thinking that." She looked at her hands. "I would like Harlan Greer to be unable to do that to anyone else." Clara held that for a moment. "I can't promise justice for your husband," she said. "The time for that specifically has probably passed." "I know," Marta said. "I'm not asking for justice for my husband. I'm asking for Greer to be stopped." She raised her eyes. "Can you do that?" "With your help, and several others, I think I can make it very difficult for him to continue as he has been," Clara said, "which is not the same thing, but it's what's achievable." Marta nodded once. "Then tell me what you need." What Clara needed, and what Marta was positioned to provide, was documentation of the original correspondence between Marta's late husband and Greer. The letters in which Marta's husband had clearly and explicitly requested a loan arrangement rather than a sale. Those letters, added to Ballard's document and Grace Nolan's folder and Curtis Webb's water rights renegotiation and the 3 other cases Roy had identified and would be visiting in the coming days, created something that was no longer a collection of individual grievances. It created a picture. A specific, documented, professionally legible picture of a man who had used a consistent method over the course of a decade to acquire land and rights from people who were vulnerable, frightened, and trusting. Whitfield needed to see this picture before Greer had time to respond to his arrival, which meant the remaining documentation needed to be gathered in the next 8 days. Clara spent the rest of that Wednesday organizing what she had and mapping exactly what was still missing. She sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight with her notes spread around her, and she was still there when Elias came through on his way to check the barn, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and the papers and said nothing for a moment. "Greer knows about Whitfield," she said without looking up. "I heard," he said. Marta had spoken to him before she left. "Are we in trouble?" Clara looked up. "We're in a race," she said. "Which is different." She looked at the papers in front of her. "I need Roy to ride to the Webb place tomorrow, and then to the Harmon place if Roy knows of them. I need those accounts and whatever documentation they have. Roy'll go. And I need you to send word to the Dunmores tonight, not through Pete's cousin, something faster and more direct." "I can ride there myself in the morning." "Not yourself," Clara said quickly. "If Greer sees you at the Dunmores right now, it tells him something. Send someone he wouldn't expect." Elias thought for a moment. "There's a girl, 16, works for the family near the Dunmore Road. She runs messages for half the valley. Send her, tonight." He went to do it. She went back to her notes. Outside, the Montana winter pressed its full weight against the house. The cold so complete and constant it had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like the ground state of the world, the thing everything else existed within. The storm everyone had been predicting was still coming. She could feel it in the way the air had changed over the past 3 days. A particular quality of pressure, of atmosphere holding its breath before something large. She'd talked to an older rancher in town the previous week, a man named Garrett, who'd been in the valley since before she was born, and he'd looked at the northern sky and said, in the way of someone stating a fact rather than a prediction, that the worst storm in years was a matter of weeks away at most. She thought about that as she worked. She thought about what a major storm meant for the herd, and what it meant for 8 days of document gathering across a rural valley, and what it meant for a land attorney traveling from Helena on a schedule that assumed manageable winter roads. She thought about all of it and kept working, because thinking without working was just anxiety, and anxiety was something she had decided many years ago not to afford. Roy came back from Curtis Webb's property 2 days later with Webb's documented account and a name Clara hadn't heard before, a rancher named Aldridge who had lost a water claim in 1881, and had subsequently moved his family to Oregon, but whose wife had been heard to say, before they left, that what Greer had done was not legal and that she intended to prove it one day. Roy didn't know if Aldridge or his wife could be reached, but the name went into Clara's notes. The pattern was growing fuller with every new account, and with each addition it became more clearly what it was. Not a series of unfortunate transactions, but the systematic operation of a man who had learned a specific method for exploiting a specific kind of vulnerability, and had applied it methodically and patiently for over a decade. Whitfield arrived on a Thursday, 2 days earlier than expected, on a coach that had made better time than predicted because the storm everyone was predicting had not yet arrived, and the roads were hard-packed and fast. He was a compact man in his late 50s with a lawyer's face, not unpleasant, but habituated to concealing reaction, giving away less than he was taking in. He shook Elias's hand at the door and looked at Clara with the assessing look of a man who had been told something about her that he was now measuring against the reality. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "Elias tells me you've been doing the organizing." "I've been gathering evidence," Clara said. "Whether it organizes into something useful is your judgment." He looked at the table, which was covered in the sorted and annotated documentation she'd spent the past 8 days assembling, and he was quiet for a moment. "Let's find out," he said. He spent 3 hours going through the materials without speaking except to ask occasional precise questions to which Clara gave precise answers. Elias sat on the far side of the room and let them work. Pete brought coffee at some point and left it and withdrew. The fire burned low and was replenished. Outside, the afternoon moved toward evening, and the quality of the sky to the north had changed in a way that made Roy, checking on the cattle at the close of the day, stop and look for a long time before coming inside. "Storm's coming," Roy said from the doorway, looking at Whitfield and Clara. "Real one this time." Whitfield looked up from the documents for the first time in over an hour. He looked at Clara. "How much time do we have?" "A day," Roy said. "Maybe 2 if we're lucky." Whitfield looked back at the documents. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Clara watched the expression on his face with the focused attention she brought to reading people, the slight compression of his mouth, the particular quality of his stillness, the way a man's face goes when he is confronting something that is worse than he expected and more prosecutable than he hoped. "This is enough," Whitfield said finally. Clara had prepared herself, carefully and specifically, not to feel anything premature. She had told herself that those words, when they came, would not be an ending but a beginning, that they would represent the start of a process that was long and uncertain and likely to be contested at every step. She had prepared herself well, and still, when Whitfield said this is enough, something shifted in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more complicated. The particular feeling of a thing you believed in before you could prove it being confirmed in front of witnesses. She looked at Elias. He was looking at her from across the room, and in his face was the expression she'd seen only a few times before. Not quite readable, not quite contained, the look of a man who is feeling something he hasn't decided what to do with yet. Outside, the storm Roy had been watching for came down from the north in the hours after midnight. And by morning the valley was transformed and the roads were gone, and Harlan Greer was still in his warm house, not knowing what had been assembled against him in the hours before the snow. But the storm that hit the Carter Ranch in those early morning hours, the one that would become the event everyone in Red Hollow would talk about for years afterward, was not the storm anyone had been predicting. It was far worse than that. The storm came down from the north with the specific violence of something that had been building for weeks, and had finally run out of patience. By 4 in the morning, the wind had reached a pitch that made the walls of the ranch house flex in their frames, and the snow was not falling so much as being thrown, horizontal, dense, with a force that made it indistinguishable from the darkness. Clara had been awake since 2. She had woken to the change in pressure the way she'd been waking to things on this ranch for weeks now, some part of her permanently calibrated to disturbance, and she had lain in the dark for 20 minutes listening to the storm intensify before she got up and put on every layer she had. She found Roy already in the kitchen, fully dressed, his coat buttoned to the throat. "How bad?" she said. "Bad," he said. No elaboration. Roy had grown up in Montana and had a native's vocabulary for winter severity, a single word carrying all the weight that other people would have needed paragraphs for. Elias came in from the barn a few minutes later, snow-covered to the shoulders, his face set in the compressed way that meant he had already seen something he didn't like. He stamped the snow from his boots at the door and looked at Clara and Roy. "The southeast fence line is down," he said. Clara felt the information land in her chest like a stone dropped in cold water. The southeast pasture, the older animals, the ones she had spent 2 months carefully protecting. "How much of it?" she said. "I don't know. I couldn't see past 20 feet. He was pulling off his outer gloves, his hands stiff with cold. "The wind's coming from the northeast, which means it's hitting the southeast corner direct. That's where we concentrated the oldest animals," Clara said, though she knew he knew this. It was the kind of statement you made when your mind was trying to stay ahead of the disaster rather than sit inside it. "I know," Elias said. Whitfield appeared in the doorway of the room he'd been given, fully dressed, which told Clara he'd been awake for a while and had the good sense not to interfere with what was happening, but the presence of mind to be ready. He looked at the three of them. "What do you need?" "Nothing yet," Elias said. "This isn't your kind of problem." "I grew up on a farm in Illinois," Whitfield said. "I know how to work a fence line." Elias looked at him briefly and then let it go. There was no time for the usual social protocols around help offered by people you'd just met. "Get your coat," he said. Pete appeared from outside, ice in his eyebrows, breathing hard. "3 of the older cows are through the gap already," he said. "I could see that much. They went east." East was into the open valley. Open valley in a storm of this severity, at this temperature, with animals that were already the most vulnerable on the property. Clara did the calculation in the 2 seconds it took her to cross the kitchen and reach her coat on its hook. She knew what happened to cattle that moved downwind in a blizzard. They kept walking. They didn't turn back into the wind. They walked until they hit a barrier, or until the cold took them, whichever came first. And in the Carter Ranch's East Valley, there was no barrier for nearly 4 miles. "I'll go after them," she said. "No," Elias said immediately. "I know where they'll go," she said. She was pulling on her outer coat, her voice flat and fast. "There's a low draw about 1.5 miles east, where the old creek bed cuts south. Animals moving downwind in this direction will hit that draw and stop. It's the first real windbreak they'll reach. If they stop there, we can bring them back. If we wait until morning, they'll be past it." "You can't go out in this alone," Elias said. "Then come with me," Clara said. "Roy stays with the fence. Pete and Whitfield work the southeast pasture and keep the rest of the animals from going through the gap." She looked at Elias. "We have about an hour before those 3 animals are too far to recover." The argument lasted approximately 8 seconds, which was all the time Elias spent looking at her face and understanding that she was not going to be talked out of this, and that she was probably right, which he hated, and that the fastest resolution was to get his coat and move. "Take the 2 ropes from the barn," he said to Pete, "and the lantern. The big one." They went out into the storm together. Clara and Elias, and the world outside the ranch house was a different world entirely. White and roaring and without depth or perspective, everything reduced to the few feet immediately visible, and the terrible sense of space pressing in from every direction. Clara kept her face turned slightly to the side against the wind, reading the direction from the feel of it on her left cheek, and she moved with the careful, deliberate pace of someone who knows that speed in this terrain and this visibility is how you fall into something you can't get out of. Elias was behind her and to the right, close enough that she could hear him through the wind if she turned her head. He didn't talk. She didn't either. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. The first 100 yards were the worst. Open ground between the ranch buildings and the pasture fence, fully exposed to the northeast wind, the snow coming in with a force that made breathing a considered activity. Clara pulled her scarf up over her nose and mouth and pushed through it with the single-minded quality of someone who has decided that difficulty is not a reason to stop. Her legs were cold within the first 50 steps. That was manageable. What wasn't manageable was the visibility, which dropped and spiked unpredictably as the wind gusted. One moment she could see 30 feet, the next she could see 3. She was navigating by memory and by ground feel. The specific texture of the pasture under her boots, the slight downward slope that she knew preceded the low draw, the way the wind shifted in direction fractionally when the terrain began to channel it. She had walked this ground in every weather since arriving at the ranch, because she had understood from the beginning that knowing land in good conditions was insufficient. You had to know it in the conditions that were going to matter. Behind her, Elias kept pace. She heard him once say something that got stripped away by the wind before it reached her, and she didn't ask him to repeat it. If it was important, he'd say it again. He trusted her sense of direction in this, she understood, because he had no better information than she did, and because the space between them over the past months had built the specific quality of trust that comes from watching someone be right repeatedly about things that mattered. The draw came up faster than she expected. The ground dropped and the wind shifted, and suddenly there was a bowl of relative quiet. Not silence, but a lessening, the way sound changes when terrain starts absorbing it instead of reflecting it. She grabbed Elias's arm before he walked past her and pointed down. 3 shapes in the dark, moving slowly, pressed together, heads down. Cattle, when they're in distress, make a specific sound that is different from their usual vocalizations. Lower, more continuous, the sound of animals that have stopped processing options and are simply enduring. These 3 were making that sound. Clara could hear it under the wind as she moved down the slope of the draw toward them, and she recognized it the way you recognize the language of something you've listened to carefully for a long time. Getting 3 frightened animals moving in the right direction, back into a wind they didn't want to face, in the dark, in a blizzard, with 2 people and 2 ropes. This was not something that went well. Clara had not expected it to go well. She had expected it to go the way it went, which was badly and slowly, and with a great deal of repositioning and waiting and quiet, persistent pressure. The animals didn't want to move north. The wind was from the northeast, and their instinct was to keep their backs to it. Turning them meant working around behind each one and pushing, gently and firmly and repeatedly, in the direction of the ranch, and then holding the ground gained while the other person moved to the next animal. Elias worked without being told. He had been moving cattle his entire life, and in the half-dark of the draw, she could see him reading each animal's weight and balance and choosing his position accordingly, doing the quiet physical negotiation of a man who understood livestock in his body rather than just his mind. There was a moment, the second animal, a large older cow who outweighed Clara by several hundred pounds and was not cooperating, when the animal swung its head sharply and Clara went down in the snow. Hard. Her knee found something solid under the white surface, and the impact was bright and immediate, and she lay there for a second with her face in the cold, processing it. Elias was beside her before she'd fully registered the fall. I'm up, she said, and got up. Her knee hurt. It would hurt more later. Right now she had an animal to move and a ranch to get back to, and the wind was not getting any warmer. She got to her feet and repositioned behind the cow and started again. It took 1 hour and 20 minutes to get the 3 animals back to the fence line. 1 hour and 20 minutes that existed outside the normal measurement of time, in the specific compressed and elongated way that physical crisis creates its own temporality. When they finally pushed through the temporary gap that Roy had created in the fence, he had been working on it the entire time they were gone, his hands bleeding from cold and wire work, the gap jury-rigged but functional, and got the animals into the lee of the barn. Clara stood for a moment in the relative shelter of the barn wall and breathed. Her knee was bad. She had known it was bad since the first 50 steps back from the draw, and she had kept the knowledge at a distance and dealt with it now that she could afford to. She put her hand down and felt through her trouser leg and found the joint swollen and hot under her fingers in the specific way that meant she had asked it to do something it had not forgiven her for yet. Elias came around the barn wall and stopped when he saw her hand on her knee. "How bad?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I have right now," Clara said. She straightened up. "How's the fence?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had no name for still, the one with too many components to resolve into a single readable thing. "Roy's got it held for now. We'll do proper repairs at first light." He paused. "You need to go inside." "I need to check the southeast pasture count first." "Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name without the formal prefix, and she heard it happen and didn't acknowledge it because acknowledging it would have made the moment strange, in a way she wasn't prepared to navigate on top of everything else. "The count first," she said, "then inside." The count showed all but the 3 recovered animals accounted for. Roy had held the southeast pasture gap through the worst of it, and Pete and Whitfield had pushed the remaining animals into the barn shelter when the fence came down far enough that the pasture was no longer defensible. It was not a clean outcome. The 3 recovered animals would need monitoring for the next 48 hours. One of the fence posts Roy had worked on had split rather than held, and the repair needed before morning would require more material than they currently had on hand, but the herd was alive. The older animals were alive. And the storm, though it continued through the rest of that night and into the following day, had done its worst and found the Carter Ranch still standing. Clara went inside at some point after 4 in the morning when the most urgent things had been addressed, and the things that couldn't be addressed until daylight were set aside for daylight. She sat at the kitchen table with her boot off, and her knee propped on a chair, and a cup of something hot that Pete had made without being asked and set in front of her without comment. Whitfield was at the other end of the table, writing in a notebook by the lamplight, and he looked up when she sat down and looked at her knee and said nothing about it, which she respected. "Productive night," he said instead. "Expensive," she said. "Most productive things are." He went back to his notebook. "The documentation I reviewed yesterday evening. I'd like to spend the morning organizing it into the format the county recorder's office will require, before the roads open." Clara looked at him. Her knee was throbbing with a regularity that she was trying to treat as informational rather than distressing. "You've decided how to proceed?" "I've decided how I would proceed if you're asking me to," Whitfield said. He set down his pen. "What Greer has done is not untraceable. It was designed to be difficult to challenge. Individual cases, individual victims, separated by time and circumstance. But assembled as a pattern, with documentation from multiple parties showing consistent methodology, it becomes something a judge can see as a whole rather than a series of disputed transactions." He paused. "The question is whether you want to take this to the county recorder first or to the territorial court directly." "Which is faster?" Clara asked. "Recorder's office is faster, and it establishes the documentation formally before Greer can contest the individual pieces." "Then the recorder's office first," Clara said. "What do you need from me?" "A signed account from each of the 5 parties whose documentation we have," Whitfield said. "Ballard, Nolan, Webb, Marta Henderson's material, and the Dunmores if they're willing to confirm what they were told about the Carter Ranch's financial situation." "The Dunmores are a different kind of witness," Clara said. "They weren't defrauded. They were manipulated into potentially acting against their own legal agreement." "Which is still actionable," Whitfield said. "And it speaks to the pattern of Greer's method. Not just the fraud, but the ongoing management of his position through false information." He picked his pen back up. "Can you get them here?" "When the road opens," Clara said. "Yes." The road opened on the second day after the storm, which was faster than anyone had expected because 3 ranching families from the northern end of the valley had independently come out with shovels and work animals and cleared the main road from sheer necessity. The way frontier communities addressed problems when waiting for someone else to fix them was not viable. Clara sent Pete to the Dunmores that morning. She sent Roy to Jim Ballard and to Grace Nolan, with letters she had written the previous day while her knee was elevated and her handwriting was slightly worse than usual but still legible. She wrote to Curtis Webb herself and asked him to come when he could. She wrote to Marta Henderson and asked her to come to the ranch rather than meeting in town, because she did not want Greer's network seeing the pattern of these movements yet. Elias, meanwhile, was rebuilding the southeast fence with Pete's help when Pete returned from the Dunmores. The fence work was hard and cold and went slowly because the split post had to be replaced entirely, and the ground was frozen in a way that made post setting a 2-person job that neither of the 2 people found straightforward. Elias worked with the focused unhappiness of a man doing necessary things in difficult conditions who was also thinking about something else entirely. What he was thinking about, Clara didn't know specifically, but she had come to know the quality of his preoccupation well enough to identify it from a distance. He was thinking about Whitfield and the documents and what came next, which was the same thing she was thinking about, which was the specific problem of moving from a private investigation to a public challenge without giving Greer enough warning to prepare his response. The response, when it came faster than she'd calculated. Harlan Greer arrived at the Carter Ranch on the 3rd day after the storm, alone, in the late morning, riding a good horse through the cleared road with the bearing of a man who has decided to demonstrate that he is not concerned. He came to the front of the house and dismounted and knocked on the door with the deliberate, unhurried knock of someone who is not asking permission. Clara opened the door. Greer looked at her with the specific expression she had first seen on Main Street, The inventory look, the slow assessment that was designed to communicate diminishment. But there was something different under it this time, something she hadn't seen there before. Not anxiety exactly. Greer was too practiced for visible anxiety. But a tightness that hadn't been there in the fall, a quality of managed tension. He was, she understood with a clarity that was almost physical, afraid. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Is Carter here?" "He's working the south fence," she said. She did not step back from the doorway. "I'd like to speak with him." "You can speak with me," Clara said. Greer looked at her for a moment. He had, she thought, not expected this. Had expected to find Elias and conduct a conversation that left her peripheral, the way most of his conversations about the ranch had treated her. He recalculated, visibly, and it cost him something to do it. "I hear you've had someone from Helena visiting," he said. "We've had a guest," Clara said. "A legal guest." "We're entitled to consult with whomever we choose," she said. "Was there something specific you came to discuss, Mr. Greer?" He looked at her steadily. "I want to know what's being said about me," he said, and it was the most direct thing she had ever heard him say, stripped of the social performance, the implication and indirection, and she thought that the stripping itself was information. A man like Greer did not ask direct questions unless the indirect approach had stopped working. "I imagine a number of things are being said about you," Clara said. "People in this valley talk. You know what I mean." "I know what you're afraid of," she said. She said it quietly, not as a challenge, but as a statement. "You're afraid that the individual cases that seemed safely separated by time and circumstance have begun to look less separate when examined together." She met his eyes. "That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of." Greer was very still for a moment. The managed tension quality she'd identified was more visible now, pulled close to the surface by the directness of the conversation. "That would require people talking to each other," he said. "People in this valley don't generally—" "They do when someone gives them a reason to," Clara said, "and a safe way to do it." The silence between them was the most honest communication they had ever had. Everything that had been conducted through implication and performance and the social theater of frontier respectability, the Main Street speech, the feed store audience, the bank visits, the fence sabotage, all of that was stripped away in this moment. And what was left was simply two people who understood each other completely, standing in a doorway in the Montana winter. Greer spoke first. "Whatever you think you have," he said, and his voice had changed. Quieter, colder, the voice beneath the performance. "It won't hold. These are rural transactions made under drought conditions. Courts in this territory understand that. Business gets done under pressure and sometimes terms get misrepresented," Clara said. "Renegotiated," he said, "under legitimate, with documents that don't match what the signatories understood they were signing," Clara said, which Horace Whitfield, who has been admitted to practice in this territory for 19 years, is prepared to characterize in specific legal terms. She paused. "Under oath." Greer looked at her. The inventory look was gone. What replaced it was simpler and in some ways more honest. Just a man looking at the shape of what had been assembled against him, calculating the distance between where he stood and where he thought he'd be standing. "You've made a serious mistake," he said. "I don't think I have," Clara said. "But we'll find out." He got back on his horse without another word. She watched him ride back down the cleared road toward Red Hollow, straight-backed, unhurried in appearance, and she stood in the doorway until he was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at the table and let herself shake for about 30 seconds, because her knee hurt, and the cold had gotten into her while she stood there, and she was not, despite everything, made of stone. 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the accounts she was organizing for Whitfield. Elias came in at midday and she told him about Greer's visit. She watched his face move through several stages. Surprised that Greer had come at all, something harder at what had been said, and then the compressed quality that meant he was holding something down by force. "He threatened you," Elias said. "He made an observation," Clara said. "There's a difference." "Not much of one." "Enough," she said. "He came here because he's worried. Men who are confident don't show up in person to ask direct questions." Elias sat down across from her. He looked at the organized documentation on the table, Whitfield's arrangement of it, the signed accounts that had been coming in over the past 2 days, the survey maps, and the original correspondence. He looked at it with the expression of a man confronting something he was still in the process of understanding was real. "When did you know this was possible?" he said. "Really know." Clara considered the question. "When Ballard opened the wooden box," she said. "When I saw that he'd kept everything, that he hadn't given up on the idea that it mattered." She paused. "One person's careful records is a grievance. Multiple people's careful records is evidence. And Greer didn't know they'd kept them. Greer bet on people being too tired or too ashamed to hold on to documentation of something painful," Clara said. "He was right about most of them. He wasn't right about Ballard, and he wasn't right about Grace Nolan, and he wasn't right about Marta Henderson." She looked at her pen. He was betting on the same human quality he'd been exploiting, the tendency to absorb a loss and move on rather than carry the weight of contesting it. Elias was quiet for a moment. He underestimated them. He underestimated what people do with pain when someone finally gives them a reason to believe it matters, Clara said. The Dunmores arrived that afternoon, Frank and Edgar together, in Frank's wagon, with the particular expressions of men who have made a decision they're not entirely comfortable with but are committed to. They sat at the table with Whitfield and gave their account of Greer's visit and what he'd suggested about the Carter Ranch's financial situation, and Frank produced, to Clara's considerable satisfaction, a written note he'd made the day after Greer's man had visited them, a contemporaneous record of what had been said, in Frank's neat, careful handwriting, which Whitfield received with the specific quality of professional appreciation. "You wrote this at the time?" Whitfield said. "The same afternoon," Frank said. "My wife told me to. She said if someone was trying to influence us about another man's finances, we should write down exactly what they said, in case it mattered later." Whitfield looked at the note. "Your wife was correct," he said. Grace Nolan arrived the following morning, having ridden through the partially cleared roads with the determination of a woman for whom the inconvenience of a February journey was not a relevant consideration when weighed against what was at stake. She sat with Whitfield for 2 hours, going through her documentation with the precise attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of examination, and she signed the account he prepared with a hand that did not hesitate. Jim Ballard came in the afternoon. Curtis Webb sent his signed account with Roy rather than coming himself, which Clara respected. He had a wife and 3 young children, and the roads were still difficult, and his written account was as useful as his presence. Marta Henderson came on the 4th day, bringing with her not only the correspondence she'd described, but 2 additional letters she hadn't mentioned previously, letters from Greer to her late husband that contained, in Greer's own handwriting, language that Whitfield read twice and then set down very carefully on the table. "This is direct evidence of misrepresentation," Whitfield said, "not inference from documentation comparison." His own words describing the transaction in terms inconsistent with what the signed documents show. He looked at Clara. "Where did you find this woman?" "She found me," Clara said. Marta, sitting across the table, said nothing. She looked at the letters that her husband had received 17 years ago and that she had kept in the same cabinet where she kept the household accounts. And her face was the specific stillness of a person who has been waiting for something for a long time and is now in the room where it is happening. The filing with the county recorder's office in Clearwater Junction happened on a Thursday, 8 days after the storm. Whitfield went himself, with the complete documentation organized into the formal submission package he'd been preparing since his arrival. Clara could not go. Her knee had made the decision for her, swollen past the point where a 12-mile ride was a practical option, regardless of what she thought about it. And she had argued with this reality for one morning, and then accepted it because accepting limitations you cannot change is the only productive response to them. She heard the result from Whitfield when he returned that evening, coming into the kitchen still in his traveling coat, dropping his bag on the floor with the particular weight of a man who has done something significant and is now putting it down. "It's filed," he said, "all of it, under the territory's land fraud provisions and the misrepresentation statute. The recorder's office will notify the parties and the county judge within 10 days. He paused. "And Harlan Greer will be notified that his land transactions of the past decade are under formal review." The room was quiet for a moment. Elias, standing near the window, turned around and looked at Whitfield and then at Clara. Roy exhaled in the specific way of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. Pete said quietly, "What happens now?" "Now," Whitfield said, sitting down at the table. It goes to the legal process, which is slow and imperfect and will probably be contested at every stage. Greer will hire lawyers. He'll argue each case individually. He'll find procedural grounds for delay. He looked at Clara. I want you to be prepared for that. I'm prepared for it, Clara said. It could take a year, more. I know. And there's no guarantee. I know, Clara said again. She looked at him steadily. But the documentation is filed. It's formal and public and attached to his name. And whatever happens in the courts, he cannot now approach frightened people in this valley and position himself as a helpful neighbor. She paused. That part is already done. Whitfield looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has, over the course of 10 days in a Montana ranch house in February, significantly revised his understanding of what was possible for a person to accomplish through the organized application of patience and intelligence. He did not say what he was thinking. He was too much of a lawyer for that. But Clara saw it, and she let it sit, and she went back to the kitchen to put on coffee because there was still work to do and the evening had barely started. The news moved through Red Hollow in the particular way of news that people have been half expecting, not with the explosive speed of a pure surprise, but with a rolling building quality, each telling adding something to the understanding of what it meant. By the end of the first week after the filing, most people in the valley knew that Harlan Greer's land dealings were under formal territorial review, that the filing had been made by a Helena attorney on behalf of multiple parties, and that the documentation included records going back more than a decade. By the end of the second week, the conversation in Red Hollow had shifted in a way that Clara noted without celebrating. The men who had stood near Harlan Greer at Henderson's Feed and Supply and laughed at Elias Carter's judgment were still in the town, still buying their supplies and conducting their business. But the easy confidence of people who are aligned with the powerful was gone from their posture. They had recalculated. You could see it. Not in apologies, those would not come mostly, and Clara had not expected them, but in the specific way that people who have been wrong adjust their presentation of themselves in public. They became quieter. They stopped telling the story about the woman at Carter's ranch. Aldous Fry at the Clearwater Junction Bank sent Elias a letter noting that the review of the ranch's loan status would be tabled pending the outcome of the territorial proceeding, which was the bank's careful way of saying that the ground under Greer's influence on their decision-making had shifted. It was not a guarantee. It was breathing room, which was what Clara had been building toward since November. On a Saturday in late February, 3 weeks after the storm, Clara was in the barn doing the morning check on the 3 recovered animals when Elias came in and stood near the door in the way he had when he wanted to say something and was arranging it. She waited. The Gazette and Billings is running a piece, he said finally, about the filing. Whitfield sent them the summary. He paused. They're describing it as a pattern of land fraud affecting multiple valley families over more than a decade. Good, Clara said. She was examining the older cow's coat, running her hand along the shoulder to check the temperature differential, still slightly lower than it should be, but improving. Greer's leverage in this valley depends on people not knowing the full scope of what he's been doing. A newspaper account changes that. It mentions you, Elias said. She looked up. By name. Describes you as the person who organized the documentation. She turned back to the cow. That's accurate. People in town are going to read it. I expect so. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the back of her head in the way she'd come to know meant he was working up to something that did not come easily to him. Elias Carter was not a man who found direct emotional expression natural. She had understood this from early on, and she had not pushed against it because it was not her business to push against who people were, only to work alongside them as they were. I was wrong, he said, about what I thought this was going to be when I posted that notice, what I thought you were going to be. Clara let that sit for a moment. You weren't wrong, she said. You just didn't have enough information. Clara. You adjusted when you got more information, she said. That's not being wrong. That's just... She turned around and looked at him, being the kind of person who can be convinced by evidence. He looked at her across the dim space of the barn, with the older cow between them and the winter light coming through the door slats in thin lines. And the expression on his face was the one she still didn't have a name for, but had stopped trying to name. Some things were more accurately left as what they were, rather than what they resembled. Stay, he said. Past the original agreement. Stay on. She looked at him. In what capacity? Whatever capacity you want, he said. Partner. Whatever the right word is. The question settled into her like something that had been looking for its location for a long time. She thought about Ohio, about the $42 in the trunk, about the posting and the two-word reply, and the morning she'd first read the soil in the East pasture and understood that she had found, for the first time in a long time, a place where her specific way of seeing things was not a liability. Ask me again in the spring, she said, when we see what the calves look like. He almost smiled. The almost smile she'd learned to read, over months, as the equivalent of a full smile on anyone else. Fair enough, he said, and went back out to the fence line. Clara turned back to the old cow and put her hand on the animal's shoulder again, feeling the warmth that was slowly returning to the coat, the gradual recovery of something that had been close to lost. Outside, the Montana winter was still hard and uncompromising, but the light had been changing for 2 weeks. Longer days, the particular quality of afternoon sun that did not yet warm anything but promised to. The spring calving was 6 weeks out. Whitfield's filing was working its way through the legal channels with the slow, grinding certainty of institutional process. The herd was alive and recovering. The documentation was in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. And Harlan Greer, somewhere in Red Hollow, was sitting with the particular knowledge of a man who has discovered that the ground he built on was less solid than he'd believed, and that the woman he'd laughed at on Main Street had been the one, all along, who understood what the ground was actually made of. 6 weeks after Elias asked her to stay, the first calves came. It was a Monday in early April, before full light, when Pete came to the kitchen door still pulling on his coat and said, with the particular breathless quality of someone delivering news he'd been waiting to deliver, that the first two had arrived in the night and both were standing. Clara was already dressed. She had been waking before the ranch for months now, the habit of early vigilance having embedded itself so deeply she no longer noticed it as a choice. She went to the barn with Pete and stood in the cold morning dark and looked at what 6 months of careful, unglamorous, largely invisible work looked like when it became tangible. The calves were standing, both of them within hours of birth, on legs that were finding their certainty, nursing with the focused insistence of new animals that have not yet learned anything except that they are hungry and that warmth exists and that they should move toward it. Clara put her hand on the nearest one's back and felt the heat of it, the specific, astonishing heat of new life in a cold barn, and did not say anything for a while. Elias came in a few minutes later and stood beside her. He looked at the calves and then looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them made a speech about it, which was appropriate, because the moment did not require a speech. It required exactly what it had: two people standing in a barn in the cold of an April morning, looking at the results of work that had been hard and slow and mostly invisible, and understanding without saying it that this was what the work had been for. Coat's good, Elias said. He meant the calf's coat, the thickness and luster of it, which was measurably different from the previous 2 years' calves, and which represented the cumulative effect of 6 months of supplementation and targeted nutrition. He was not a man who overstated things. Both of them, Clara said. Both, he agreed. Over the following 2 weeks, 31 more calves arrived, and of those 33 total, 32 survived the first critical week. The one loss was an animal that had been struggling before it was born, a situation Clara had identified 3 days before the birth and had prepared Elias for without false comfort. The loss was real, and she did not minimize it. But 32 healthy calves against the previous year's 21. The difference was not subtle, and it was not luck. Roy counted them twice and came to Clara with the second count and looked at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. It was not gratitude exactly. Roy was not demonstratively grateful, which she had long since understood and accepted. It was something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has watched something happen that he was not entirely certain was possible and has revised his estimate of what is possible accordingly. The Northwest pasture calves, Roy said. 4 of them, all strong. Last year those same animals gave us 2 calves, and one of them didn't make it to May. The mineral supplementation, Clara said. I know what it was, Roy said. He paused. I just wanted to say that I know. She nodded. That was the end of the conversation, and it was enough. The legal process moved the way Whitfield had warned it would, slowly, with the grinding impersonality of institutional machinery that processes cases in the order they arrive, regardless of how urgently the people involved need resolution. Harlan Greer had retained a lawyer from Billings, a man named Coburn, who had a reputation for procedural delay and who began exercising that reputation immediately, filing a series of responses to the county recorder's documentation that challenged the authentication of individual pieces of evidence and the standing of individual claimants. Whitfield had anticipated this. He had in fact built the submission precisely to withstand it. The multiple source corroboration, the contemporaneous documentation, Frank Dunmore's handwritten note, and above all the Marta Henderson letters, which were Greer's own handwriting and which Coburn could not authenticate away without calling his own client a liar in court. The authentication challenges failed, one by one, through spring and into early summer. Each failure a procedural data point that built the cumulative portrait of a defense running out of legitimate objections. Clara tracked it through Whitfield's letters, which arrived every 2 to 3 weeks with the methodical regularity of a man who understood that information was its own form of support. She read each letter at the kitchen table and summarized the relevant developments for Elias, who did not read legal correspondence easily but understood it when it was translated into direct language, which she had become skilled at doing. The ranch did not stop during the legal process. The ranch never stopped. This was something Clara had come to understand as fundamental, not just about ranching, but about the nature of sustained work in general. The world did not pause its demands while you dealt with its crises. The cattle needed feeding while the legal filings moved through channels. The summer pasture rotation needed managing while the territorial court scheduled hearings. The fences needed maintaining, and the water sources needed monitoring, and the books needed keeping, all of it simultaneously, all of it without the satisfaction of visible and immediate results. She had, somewhere in the process of learning this ranch, stopped finding the simultaneousness of it exhausting and started finding it clarifying. This was simply what a working life looked like. Not a sequence of problems solved one at a time, but a constant parallel management of everything at once, with the understanding that perfection was not available and that good enough, consistently sustained, was the actual standard. The summer was the best the Carter Ranch had seen in 4 years. The calves that had arrived in April were healthy and growing. The pasture recovery, which Clara had been tracking since October, was measurably further along than the previous summer. Not fully recovered, but moving in the right direction with the specific momentum of something that has been given what it was missing. Elias sold a portion of the spring cattle at the summer market in Clearwater Junction, and the numbers came back better than his most optimistic calculation, which he told Clara with the slightly stunned quality of a man who had spent so long planning for insufficient outcomes that sufficient ones felt unfamiliar. "That's what the work was supposed to do," Clara said. "I know," he said. "I'd just forgotten what it felt like." She understood that. She had spent enough of her own life working toward things that seemed to stay just out of reach, that she recognized the specific quality of his disorientation, the mild vertigo of getting what you'd worked for, when you'd learned to function as though you wouldn't. The territorial court hearing was scheduled for late August, in Helena, and Whitfield sent word 3 weeks before it that he needed Clara there. Not as a witness in the legal sense. Her formal role in the proceedings was as the organizing party, the person who had assembled the documentation and coordinated the complainants, but because her presence mattered for reasons that were practical and symbolic in equal measure. The complainants would be there: Ballard, Nolan, Webb, Marta Henderson. They had held together through 6 months of delay and procedural challenge, and Whitfield believed they would hold through the hearing. But he wanted Clara there. Elias said he was coming too. Clara told him it wasn't necessary. He looked at her in the way that had become one of his primary modes of communication: direct, unhurried, containing more than it appeared to, and said that was not the criterion he was using. She did not argue further. They traveled to Helena by coach over 3 days, a journey that was not comfortable and that Elias endured with the stoic resignation of a man who does not enjoy coaches but understands that this particular journey serves a purpose that outweighs his preferences. Clara spent most of the travel reading and making notes, and when she was not reading, she was looking at the country moving past the window. The broad back of Montana in summer, the grass gone golden in the high places, the mountains still snow-capped even in August, the scale of it all that never quite became ordinary, no matter how long you looked at it. On the second night, in a small hotel in a town whose name she would not remember later, Elias said, without preamble and without looking at her directly. When this is over, the question I asked you in February. Clara set down her pen. They were at a table in the small dining room, the only people in it at this hour. I remember the question, she said. I'm asking it again. In the spring you said to wait until we saw the calves. He paused. We saw the calves. She looked at him across the table. This man who communicated in 2 words and spoke an understatement and had asked her to check the soil in the east pasture himself rather than simply take her word for it, and who had sat in the kitchen listening to her at midnight, and had handed her coffee in the dark, and had gone out into a blizzard beside her without asking her to justify herself. This man who was not easy, and who was not simple, and who was not the version of himself that Red Hollow's easier story would have made him, a ruined rancher saved by circumstances, who was instead a man who had kept asking the right questions even when the answers were harder than the questions. What would partner mean, she said, specifically? He thought about it. Half the decisions, he said, half the work. Your name in the ledger. He paused again. Whatever else you want it to mean. Clara looked at her notes on the table. Then she looked at him. I want it to mean that when I say the north corner of a pasture has a problem, that's the end of the discussion about whether there's a problem. It already means that, he said. I know, she said. I want it formalized. He almost smiled. Done, he said. They finished their dinner without further ceremony, because they were not people who required ceremony, and in the morning they continued to Helena. The hearing lasted 2 days. Harlan Greer sat at a table on the opposite side of the courtroom with his lawyer, Coburn, and he was dressed with the careful presentation of a man who wants the court to see him as a respectable figure. Good coat, composed expression, the practiced stillness of someone who has sat through uncomfortable proceedings before and knows how to perform patience. Clara watched him from across the room with the same steady attention she'd been bringing to him since October, looking for what was real under the performance. What she saw, on the first day, was a man who was more contained than she'd expected. She had thought, had half expected, that the formal setting of the court would strip some of the composure away, that the accumulation of evidence would be visible on his face. But Greer was better at this than that. He had, presumably, sat through other uncomfortable moments in his life and had learned how to close his face around them. He listened to Whitfield's opening presentation with an expression of attentive skepticism, and he leaned occasionally to speak quietly to Coburn, and he was, Clara thought, genuinely skilled at the performance of not being afraid. But she had seen him afraid once, in the doorway of the Carter Ranch house, in February, with the snow still on the road and the question of what had been assembled against him sitting between them. She had seen the real thing then, under all the management, and she held that in her mind now as she watched him perform calm across the courtroom, because the performance was not the same as the reality, and she had learned over many years not to confuse them. Whitfield presented the case in the order he'd designed. The broadest context first, establishing the pattern of timing and method, and then the individual documentation, each case building on the previous one in a sequence that showed the consistency of Greer's approach across different victims, different years, different specific transactions. He was methodical and precise and entirely without theatrics, which Clara had come to understand was his particular strength. He did not try to make the judge angry. He tried to make the judge see clearly, and those were different goals with different strategies. Jim Ballard testified on the first afternoon. He sat in the witness chair with the straight spine of a man who has been waiting for this for 4 years and is not going to flinch now that it's arrived. He told his story in the plain, direct way he'd told it to Clara in his kitchen in December, and he was unshakable under Coburn's cross-examination, which attempted to suggest that the terms he remembered had simply been different from the terms he'd agreed to. A memory problem, not a fraud. Ballard looked at Coburn with the patient contempt of a man who knows what he knows and said quietly that he had read every document he'd ever signed in his life until Greer's man sat at his table and told him it was a formality, and that this was the one time he had not read carefully, and that this was not a coincidence. Grace Nolan testified on the second morning and was a different kind of witness, harder, more precise, her anger visible not as emotion but as fuel, powering the exact and unsparing account of what had happened 2 months after her husband's funeral. She brought to the stand the same organized folder she'd brought to Clara's kitchen visit, and she walked the court through it document by document, with the systematic attention of a woman who had organized this material in her own mind so many times that the formal occasion of presenting it barely changed the quality of her focus. Coburn tried to suggest that a widow, newly bereaved, in difficult financial circumstances, might have misunderstood the terms she was presented with. Grace Nolan looked at him and said that she had understood the terms she was presented with entirely, and that the document she'd signed did not reflect those terms, and that she had a letter from a qualified attorney in Great Falls who had examined both documents and reached the same conclusion. Coburn did not linger on this line of questioning. Marta Henderson testified last, on the second afternoon, and the letter she had brought, Greer's own handwriting, describing the transaction with her husband in terms that contradicted the signed documents, entered the formal record of the proceeding with the weight of something that cannot be argued around without absurdity. Coburn attempted to argue around it anyway, suggesting the letters might have been referring to a different transaction, a suggestion so implausible that the judge's expression changed in a way that was visible to everyone in the room. Clara did not testify. Her role was as the organizing party, documented in Whitfield's filing but not requiring her presence in the witness chair. She sat in the gallery behind the complainant's table and watched and listened with the attention she had brought to everything in this valley since October, reading faces and tones and the small shifts that revealed what the formal language was not saying. She watched the judge most carefully. He was a man in his early 60s named Harrington, who had the look of someone who had been a judge in this territory long enough to have seen most things and to have developed, as a result, a well-calibrated detector for the difference between a disputed business transaction and a systematic pattern of predatory fraud. She watched him watch Greer, and on the second afternoon during Marta Henderson's testimony, she saw something shift in Judge Harrington's face. Subtle, controlled, the small recalibration of a man who has landed on a conclusion and is now simply hearing the remaining evidence to confirm it rather than to form it. She did not celebrate this. She filed it in the careful part of her mind that kept track of what was real versus what she wanted to be real, and she waited. The ruling came 3 weeks after the hearing. Whitfield sent it by express post, and Clara received it on a Wednesday morning and read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. The territorial court found in favor of the complainants on 4 of the 5 cases brought: Ballard, Nolan, Henderson, and a combined finding on the Webb and Dunmore matters that addressed Greer's pattern of misrepresenting property values to third-party lenders and leaseholders. The 5th case, Curtis Webb's water rights claim, was remanded for a separate proceeding on a technical jurisdictional question, which Whitfield had anticipated and which he noted in his accompanying letter was likely to be resolved in Webb's favor within the following 6 months. Greer was ordered to restore the land transaction proceeds to Ballard and Nolan, with interest calculated from the date of each transaction. His commercial grazing leases in the valley were placed under a 2-year court supervision requirement, during which any renegotiation or transfer required judicial approval. The court's finding included language describing his conduct as a systematic pattern of misrepresentation exploiting the vulnerability of parties under financial and personal duress, which was, in the dry language of territorial court, as close to a condemnation as the institution produced. It was not everything. Ballard would not get his East 40 back. The land had changed hands twice since, and the chain of title was too complicated to unwind. Grace Nolan's original lease terms could not be restored, only compensated. The process had taken nearly a year from Clara's first conversation with Whitfield, and had cost the complainants in time and anxiety and the slow grinding toll of being in a legal proceeding for months. These were real costs, and the ruling did not undo them. But Harlan Greer's method, the careful, patient, decade-long exploitation of vulnerable people through misrepresented documents, was now part of the formal public record of the territory. His name was attached to a court finding that described exactly what he had done and how he had done it. The architecture of trust and respectability and institutional connection that he had built and that had made his method viable was damaged in ways that could not be quietly repaired. The banks would not listen to him the same way. The leaseholders would read their documents twice. The people in the valley who had deferred to his confident presentations of risk would know now to be less deferential. The ability to operate as he had operated was gone. That was the real consequence, not the financial penalty, significant as it was. The method itself had been made visible, which meant it could no longer function. Clara read the ruling twice, folded it carefully along its original creases, and sat for a moment at the kitchen table in the quiet of the early morning. The lamp was still on from when she'd gotten up. Outside, the August light was beginning, slow and golden, moving across the pasture in the way it moved in this specific corner of Montana at this specific time of year. A quality of light she had not known existed until she came here, that she had come to know so well she could predict its exact quality on any given morning. She thought about what it cost to do something over a long time. Not a quick thing, not a dramatic rescue, but the sustained, unglamorous accumulation of small right decisions made in the right order for the right reasons. The soil checks, and the supplement orders, and the letters to strangers, and the cold rides in the dark, and the hours at a kitchen table, organizing other people's painful documentation into something a court could hold. The work that looked like nothing from the outside, that had no single moment of visible heroism, that was simply the patient application of everything you had to a problem that mattered. She thought about her mother, who had kept a failing household running for 12 years on pure methodical effort, and who had never been praised for it because the praise went to the dramatic gesture, the visible sacrifice, the sacrifice that made a good story. Sustaining something quietly was invisible in a way that breaking something dramatically was not. It was also, she had come to understand, harder. Anyone could be brave for a moment. The difficulty was in being competent for months. She thought about Jim Ballard keeping that document in a wooden box for 4 years. Grace Nolan organizing her folder. Marta Henderson carrying 17 years of letters in a cabinet. People who had held on to the evidence of what had been done to them, not because they were certain anyone would ever care, but because letting go of it would have felt like letting go of the truth. There was something in that she found more moving than she could have explained clearly. The quiet stubbornness of people who kept holding on, not heroically, just persistently, just refusing to entirely give up on the idea that what happened to them mattered. She was still sitting there when Elias came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her face. "Well?" he said. She pushed the ruling across the table toward him. He sat down and read it. She watched him read it. She watched the particular quality of his stillness as he got to the core finding, and then the long exhale. Not a dramatic release, just a man letting his shoulders come down from where they'd been for the better part of a year. He looked up. "It's done," he said. "The main part," she said. "Webb's water claim still has a separate proceeding, and Greer will probably find ways to continue being difficult for years. But the ranch," Elias said. "Not a question." "The bank will receive the court's finding this week," Clara said. "Aldous Fry will have nothing left to be nervous about. The South lease is yours for the remaining 11 months, and you're in a position now to renegotiate it from strength." He held the paper in both hands and looked at it for another moment. "You did this," he said. "We did this," Clara said. "You and Roy and Pete and Ballard and Grace Nolan and Marta Henderson and Horace Whitfield and the Dunmores." She paused. "I organized it. There's a difference." "There isn't really," he said. "Not the difference you're describing." She looked at him. He looked back. This had been the quality of their communication for months now. The specific economy of two people who had spent enough time working in the same direction that they no longer needed all the words. "Elias," she said, "ask me now." He understood immediately, because he always understood her when she was direct, which was something she valued in him that she had not expected to value when she first arrived. He did not make a production of it. He said simply, "Will you stay?" "Yes," Clara said. "I'll stay." That was the whole of it. No ceremony, no performance, no version of this moment that looked like what the town of Red Hollow would have expected from a story about a woman who had come to a failing ranch and changed it. Just two people at a kitchen table in the early morning with a lamp burning and a court ruling between them and the sound of the ranch coming to life outside. Pete moving toward the barn, the cattle somewhere in the near pasture, Roy's boots on the ground beyond the window. She made coffee. He read the ruling a second time. The morning came in through the east window, the way Montana mornings came in, with a kind of unhurried authority, as though the light had all the time in the world and knew exactly where it was going. So, the autumn brought the kind of work that Clara had come to think of as the truest work. Not crisis management, not evidence gathering, not the high-stakes navigation of legal and financial threats, but the ordinary deep maintenance of something that was going to last. The pasture recovery moved into its second full cycle. The supplementation program, refined through a full year of data, was adjusted for the coming winter with the precision of something that had been tested and improved rather than merely theorized. The calves from spring were growing with the steady consistency of animals that had been right from the beginning. In October, Horace Whitfield sent a letter that included a note from the county recorder's office confirming that Curtis Webb's water rights claim had been resolved in his favor in the separate proceeding. The note was 3 lines and said everything it needed to say. Clara added it to the file she'd kept since December of the previous year, the organized record of everything that had been built and documented and submitted and decided, which she kept not out of sentimentality but because it was a record of something real, and real things deserved to be preserved. Jim Ballard came to the ranch in November, not for any legal reason, but simply because he'd been working a fence line on the road that passed closest to the Carter property, and he'd stopped in. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked with Clara and Roy about the coming winter's feed strategy, with the comfortable ease of a man who has passed through a difficult thing alongside people he trusts. He did not bring up the East 40. He did not bring up the hearing or Greer or the court ruling. He talked about cattle and weather and the particular problem of waterline maintenance in the northeast corner of his property, and when he left, he shook Clara's hand with the two-handed grip of someone meaning something by it. She understood what he meant. She did not require him to say it more clearly. Grace Nolan came through in December on her way to her son's property, and she stopped and they had tea, and Grace told her that the compensation from the court ruling had been used to expand the breeding stock she'd been carefully building since her husband died, and that next spring's foals were going to be the best she'd had in a decade. She said it without excessive emotion, in the practical tone of a woman who has decided that the best response to having been wronged is to build something better than what was taken. And Clara found this not inspiring exactly, because that word carried too much sentiment for the real thing, but correct. The truest possible version of what recovery looked like. Marta Henderson continued to run the dry goods side of Henderson's feed and supply with the same quiet competence she'd always brought to it, and she and Clara had developed, over the course of the year, the specific understated friendship of 2 women who had done something significant together and did not need to discuss it constantly to know that it was real. They saw each other in town, they exchanged information when it was useful, and they understood each other in the particular way of people whose respect has been earned through shared difficulty rather than proximity. Harlan Greer was still in Red Hollow. This was not a surprise, that men like Greer did not disappear when they were ruled against. He was quieter. He was smaller in the way that a person becomes smaller when the architecture of fear they've built around themselves is dismantled, not physically reduced, but with less of the space he'd previously occupied, the public space of reputation and confidence and presumed power. He attended town functions. He conducted his remaining business. He had hired, quietly and without announcement, a new lawyer, not Coburn, someone from outside the territory, which suggested he anticipated further legal complications. The water rights case had made the pattern of his methodology visible in ways that the previous proceeding had begun but not completed. Clara saw him once in November, at the feed store. He was at the counter, and she came in through the door, and for a moment they were in the same room, and he looked at her with an expression that was entirely different from the inventory look of Main Street in September of the previous year. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has recalculated and does not know what to do with the result. Not hostile, not deferential, something in between that had no settled name. She bought what she needed and left. She did not speak to him, and he did not speak to her. There was nothing left between them that required words. On a Saturday in late November, the first real snow of the season came down on Red Hollow in a way that was gentle and serious at the same time. The big soft flakes that meant a long storm rather than a quick one. The kind of snow that was going to settle in and stay. Clara stood at the window of the ranch house in the early evening and watched it come down on the pasture where the herd stood quiet and well-fed and properly sheltered, with the water sources maintained and the windbreaks extended and the supplementation running correctly into its second year. Elias came to stand beside her. He did this sometimes in the evenings, stood near her at the window without a particular reason, not trying to start a conversation or solve a problem, just present in the specific way that had become one of the things she relied on without having expected to rely on anything. She had not expected, when she arrived in Montana with $42 and a trunk of practical clothing, to find herself in a place that felt like a place. She had not expected to find a piece of land that she understood the way she understood it, or work that matched the specific shape of what she was capable of, or a person who would sit at a table at midnight and listen while she explained an 1871 survey map and then say simply, "What do you need?" She had not been looking for any of that. She had been looking for a room and a wage and enough stability to think about the next problem. What she'd found was something she didn't have a simple word for. Not rescue, because she hadn't been waiting to be rescued. Not love, because that word carried so much accumulated meaning from stories that were not her story. Something more specific and harder to name. A situation that fit. A place where the particular way her mind worked was useful rather than inconvenient, where the things she'd learned through difficulty had direct application, where the person beside her had asked the right question at the right moment, and then gotten out of the way while she worked. She thought about what she would tell someone, a younger version of herself perhaps, standing in an Ohio kitchen, reading a posting in the Billings Gazette, and trying to decide whether to respond. She would not tell her that it would be easy. She would not tell her that the right place would announce itself, or that the right people would recognize her value without being shown it. She would tell her, "Write the letter. Go. Be honest about what you are and what you can do, and don't apologize for the space you take up. Do the work that is in front of you with everything you have. Keep the documents. Don't let anyone convince you that what happened to you is too small to matter. And if someone asks you to prove yourself to a room full of people who have already decided you're worth less than you are, don't prove yourself to the room. Prove yourself to the problem. The problem doesn't care what you look like. The problem only cares whether you solve it." She would tell her, "The things worth having take longer than you want them to and are less glamorous than you imagined and require you to be right in the dark, when nobody is watching, more times than you are ever right in the light with an audience. And this is not a tragedy. This is just what it is. The work and the time and the dark and the patience. And then, eventually, the calves in April, standing on their own legs, the coat thickness measurably better than the previous years, warm in a cold barn on an early morning. Outside, the snow came down on Red Hollow, on the Carter Ranch, on the southeast pasture where the older animals stood with their backs to the wind in the shelter she'd built for them, on the northwest corner where the mineral depletion had been addressed, and the grass had come back stronger than the year before, on the road that ran through the valley where Ballard and Nolan and Marta Henderson and the Dunmores lived out their ordinary, extraordinary lives, having held on to the truth of what happened to them long enough for it to matter. "Good winter setup," Elias said, looking at the pasture. "Better than last year," Clara said. "Better than last year," he agreed. The snow kept coming. The herd was quiet. The lamp behind them in the kitchen made a warm square of light in the window, visible from outside. The kind of light that means someone is home, and the work for today is done, and tomorrow the work begins again. Clara watched it fall and felt the particular quality of this moment. Not triumph, not arrival, because there was no fixed destination in the kind of work that mattered. Just this: the sustained, imperfect, unglamorous, essential act of keeping something alive and making it better, one careful decision at a time. In Red Hollow, Montana, in the winter of 1884, a woman named Clara Whitmore watched the snow fall on a ranch that had been failing when she arrived and was not failing now, and understood that this was the truest kind of victory. Not the kind that anyone tells stories about, but the kind that makes it possible to still be standing when the next storm comes. Which was enough. Which had always been enough for anyone who understood what enough actually meant.